the LSE technology to our technology. But again, the final element of the price we paid was the very unique strategic value of the asset, because the future of Euronext is fundamentally different after the acquisition of Borsa Italiana versus what it would have been if Borsa Italiana had been acquired by another bidder.
Stefan, when you look at your growth prospects from here, do you assume that the LSE will lose its ability, London will lose its ability to trade many European stocks as a result of Brexit?
I have no comment to make on future regulatory developments related to Brexit.
Did you have no comment to make about?
You must have assumptions that you're making about what growth is possible, and therefore where trade takes place. Are you assuming less trade will take place in London?
No, I don't make any comments on the discussion which is in progress between the European Union and the London authorities.
I just wanted to repeat the question I asked earlier, because you gave us a great answer about cost synergies and revenue synergies, but you didn't say anything about, you didn't answer the question. Are you going to have to cut jobs? Are you going to have to cut costs actively here, Stefan?
We are going to leverage on all the capabilities of the group, of the combined group. We are going to extract synergies related to the transaction everywhere across the group, not only in Italy, but also within the other parts of the Euronext business. Those synergies will come from extraction of new revenues by the acceleration of the deployment of Borsa Italiana products across Europe, and also by cost synergies mainly driven by technology.
Stefan, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it. Thanks for talking to us. Stefan Boujnah, the CEO of Euronext. Coming up on the programme, Rolls-Royce surges again as investors go bargain hunting. The stock is up nearly 100% this week in a record rally from its 17-year low. We'll get your stock movers next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the European Market Open. 26 minutes into a trading session that looks like this, broadly positive for European stocks. Let's get to Rolls-Royce. It seems a lot of bargain hunting taking place. This stock up an incredible amount this morning, up more than 11%, in fact, more than 12% right now. A reduced short position from one particular investor, I see that, but also our team just pointing to the fact it was so weak at the start of this week. Matt, do you want to do Zalando?
Yeah, Zalando, and frankly, Pandora as well, are retailers that are saying they're going to do better than they had previously expected. They're going to do better than the streets expected. It's a COVID-fueled fashion boom, apparently, that's driving up stock in both of those retailers.
Yeah, British Land is trading higher as it talks about bringing back its dividend. And up next, sorry, Matt, up next we'll talk with Jennifer Wu she was Global Head of Sustainable Investing at JP Morgan Asset Management about ESG. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Markets. This is the European Open right now, 30 minutes into the trading day, and you're still seeing gains on the Stock 600, not the kind of gains that we had seen a little bit earlier, but up 0.4%, and we're still seeing the major equity indexes, well, actually all European equity indexes post green arrows. Now let's get the Bloomberg First Word News, your top stories from the Bloomberg Terminal. For that, we go to Laura Wright in London. Laura?
Thanks, Matt. Stimulus talks are back on. The White House has reversed its stance with President Donald Trump now wanting a comprehensive deal. It comes after House Speaker Nancy Pelosi pushed back on the idea of individual measures for different parts of the economy. She had a call with Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin yesterday. France is placing more cities on maximum alert as daily coronavirus cases topped 18,000 for a second straight day. Restrictions are being added in Lyon, Lille and Grenoble. Bars and casinos will close and restaurants and cinemas face stricter controls. Italy and Spain have also recorded the most new daily cases since April. The US is sanctioning 18 Iranian banks in a move to choke off the nation's economy. The aim is to raise pressure on Tehran to enter into a new deal constraining its nuclear ambitions. The move had been flagged well in advance, with officials weighing it for weeks. Critics say Iran already faces so many sanctions, any more won't make much difference. 13 men have been charged in a plot to overthrow the government of Michigan and kidnap the governor. Their alleged plan was to storm the Capitol building and try Governor Gretchen Whitmer for treason. Officials say the men stalked out her vacation home and planned to destroy police vehicles with Molotov cocktails. Global news 24 hours a day on air and a Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Anna, Matt.
Laura, thanks very much. Laura right there in London with your first word news. Now, the G30 is calling for urgent action on climate change to fast-track the global economy to net zero carbon. The group has today released a report asking governments and businesses to take practical steps towards economic sustainability. JP Morgan Asset Management provided direction to the project, which was co-chaired by Mark Carney and Janet Yellen. The company announced this week that it's adopting a commitment to align its financing activities in oil, electric power, and autos with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Joining us now is Jennifer Wu, Global Head of Sustainable Investing at JP Morgan Asset Management. Jennifer, thanks for joining us. I just wonder what exactly it means to align your holdings of, for example, big oil with the Paris Climate Agreement. Does that mean you're going to be selling all your big oil shares?
Thank you, Matt, for having me. Good morning. So first and foremost, yes, JP Morgan Chase this week announced its ambition to align to the Paris Agreement targets. And what that means is that across the financing portfolios that JP Morgan Chase has, it is going to set targets for the identified sectors and gradually phase out of financing to these heavily, carbon-intensive sectors and companies.
And you're recommending, good morning to you, Jennifer, you're recommending to your clients that investors should move early around this theme to take advantage. So what framework should they base those moves around?
Yeah, so I think it's pretty clear that not only you have companies that are looking to better align their own businesses with the transition to a net zero framework, but also you have policy, in many different markets whereby all of these policies are going to create what we call winners and losers as it relates to impact on financial return. So the framework that we are speaking to our clients about is it's not going to be enough to just focusing on individual companies in specific sectors, but as a result of, for example, what we're seeing in Europe with the European Green Deal, every sector will go through its own transformation. So it's very important to focus on it through, the two cornerstones of investment management. So the first one is obviously looking at individual companies and decide on, okay, in specific sectors, who are going to better benefit from the transition to a low carbon economy and who is not so prepared. But also on top of that, it's quite important to look at it from a top-down approach, i.e., how do you think about asset allocation? Which country is better positioned, and whereas which country are, have more of a physical headroom to effectively help them to go through this transition.
And I think one of the interesting things in the report, Jennifer, was that if governments use the stick approach, the report assesses a drop in GDP of about 1% by 2030. If governments use the carrot approach, the report expects an increase in GDP by 2030. Are you identifying countries that are using the carrot approach then? And can you tell us which countries you think are going to be the winners here?
Yeah, so like you said, the analysis that we have done is while we know that all of these climate mitigation policies are going to generate long-term benefits to the economy and the environment, but what we are also curious about is what are the more shorter-term impacts. So what we have done is to look at a wide range of climate policies, including carbon tax, which is more what we classify as a stick-based approach, but also green incentives for investment in green renewable, as well as low infrastructure, which is what we categorize as carrot-based approach. So combining all of these different policy options together, what we were able to find is that by 2030, at the aggregate level, the impact on global GDP will be about up 1 and down percent. What's really important is the country differences, like what you said, Matt. Right? What we have found is that certain countries have put out plans out there, and they are already investing in green energy as well as providing financing to the private sector by way of incentives for them to really further invest into these space. So there are certain countries that will truly benefit. And what we've looked at is, if we look at the countries that will be hardest hit by the transition, the likes of Russia, South Africa, Australia, Canada, and India, you could clearly see a difference between these countries whereby Australia and Canada have more physical headroom to effectively raise debt to alleviate the short-term pain arising from having to pay for a less carbon-efficient economy, whereas the others do not have that option to them.
Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us. Jennifer Wu, Global Head of Sustainable Investing at JP Morgan Asset Management. It is 8:37 here in London, 9:37 in Paris or Berlin. Next up, the bitter truth. Chocolate manufacturers have long faced criticism over their supply chains. A small Dutch company is striving to make 100% slave-free and child labour-free chocolate. Others in the sector also have big ambitions on this front, though. We will talk next to Tony's Chocolonely. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the European Market Open, 8:40 here in London, so 40 minutes into the European equity trading session. And we have some modest gains across European equity markets amidst continuing confusion over whether there will be further stimulus coming before the election, increasingly looking like something for after the US election. Now for something different. In the chocolate industry, big businesses have traditionally kept information on their supply chains close to their chests. Chocolate manufacturers have long faced criticism over their social and environmental impact in the countries where chocolate is grown, where cocoa is grown. Chocolate's key ingredient, the cocoa bean, is mainly grown in West Africa by smallholder farmers who, struggling with poverty and unable to pay workers, often turn to their children for labour. But there is one small company in the Netherlands that is trying to shine a light on this darker side of chocolate. Joining us right now is Enzo van Zensen, Tony's Chocolonely, and this is his job title, Chief Evangelist. Thanks very much for joining us, Enzo. So
nice
clearly you're waging this campaign with very laudable aims, but there are others in the sector, really big players, the likes of Barry Callebaut, who have their own targets for 2025 and trying to get on top of some of the bad practice in the supply chain. So what is your stance different from the rest of the chocolate industry?
Well, first of all, we applaud any initiative that improves the livelihoods of the farmers in Western Africa. But unfortunately, what we see is that many of these players take very voluntary steps. And unfortunately, that doesn't lead to the change that we need to see on the ground. I mean, these people are still caught in a very vicious cycle of poverty. And there's no change on the ground, whatever the big players say that they're doing to improve it.
I wonder what that leads to, Tony, because it's one thing to, for parents to make their kids go work on the farm. It's another thing to use slavery. Is that happening in the chocolate industry to a substantial extent?
Yes, unfortunately, very substantial. So there's two countries in Western Africa that produce about 60% of all cocoa in the whole wide world. That's Ghana and Ivory Coast. And in Ghana and Ivory Coast, there's 2.5 million farms that grow cocoa. On those farms, there's 2.3 million children that work there, of which 90% work under illegal circumstances. So that's 2.1 million children in Ghana and Ivory Coast alone that work under illegal circumstances. And there are very worst cases of that indeed can be called modern slavery or considered as modern slavery. So these are kids that do unpaid, forced work in that industry. So yes, unfortunately, it's a very wide problem still in the cocoa industry today. And unfortunately, it's not improving or not improving fast enough, at least.
If the West paid more for its chocolates, Enzo, would things change? I mean, Fairtrade has estimated a fair price for cocoa at $2,400 a tonne. The Cocoa Barometer Consortium says something north of $3,000 a tonne. What do you think it should be?
Well, we establish a living income reference price every year that really is more than just the fair trade price in itself, but it takes more than just paying a higher price. It also means really building long-term relationships with these farmers, helping them increase the productivity of their farms, which is really low compared to, say, cocoa farmers in Latin America. So there's more steps that need to be taken than just paying a fair price. It's really appreciating these farmers for the hard work that they do, help them increase, but also really build long-term relationships so they're not as dependent as they are always for very short time frames that they have, that they know that they can sell their cocoa beans. So it takes a lot more than just a fair price.
All right, it's a great point, and it's good, I think, to raise awareness of this, which I guess is exactly what you do as Chief Evangelist. Enzo, thanks so much for joining us. Enzo van Zensen, Tony's Chocolonely Chief Evangelist, talking about eradicating child labor, slavery, and deforestation from the chocolate industry, which I think so many people probably unknowingly support by buying chocolate bars all the time, me included. Coming up, the new Fed data suggests that the COVID-19 crisis has disproportionately rewarded a small class of billionaires. And up next, we're going to discuss wealth distribution in the U.S. This is Bloomberg.
grow, banking is coming right into our telephones. My 13-year-old banks through her phone. I bank still by going into brick and mortar places, and as they take brick and mortar places out of our community, we seem to be lost. Greenwood is bringing your bank right to your lap, right in your home. You're available to do not only savings and deposits. Their hope and goal is to grow into a lender for automobiles, for homes. Homes is the first step, the first sign and piece of wealth that many first-generation Americans or many first-generation enter into homeowners can lead to their children.
That was Grammy Award-winning Killer Mike discussing the launch of Greenwood, a new digital bank that he and a group of Black American businessmen have developed to serve local communities. Turning to wealth inequality in the United States, the 50 richest Americans now hold almost as much wealth as half of the U.S. population. New data from the Federal Reserve suggests that COVID-19 has transformed the economy in ways that have disproportionately rewarded a small class of billionaires. The central bank has taken a look at U.S. wealth through the first half of 2020, and it has shown stark disparities by race, age and class. For more, let's get to Bloomberg Quick Take reporter Jennifer Sabasaja, who joins us often on a Friday. Jen, good to speak to you. So what more did the breakdown of this Fed data reveal?
Yeah, good morning, Anna. You know, the latest Fed data really provides more evidence about this K-shaped recovery that we've been hearing economists talk about for a few weeks now. So as you mentioned, the top 1% of Americans are worth now more than half of the country. That's about 165 million people. So according to this data, their combined net worth, the top 1%, they're worth about $34.2 trillion. Compare that with the bottom 50% of earners who hold just over $2 trillion. And as you mentioned, just 50 of the richest Americans are worth just about that much. And so, you know, as you mentioned, this breakdown is really just showing the widening wealth disparity in this country. And that's just based on class. When you look at race and age, the disparities are even greater. And, you know, one of the key reasons behind this widening wealth gap, according to the Fed, is that a majority of Americans just aren't benefiting from the stock market. Many of them don't even have exposure to it, and it's declining. Compare that with the top 1%ers who now own more than 50% of equity in corporations. Anna?
Actually, I'll pick it up here, Jen, out of Berlin. I wanted to ask about not an economic issue, but a social issue. Princeton has named a residential college after a finance executive, Mellody Hobson, and have they dropped? Did they drop the president's name from an institution as well?
Yeah. So Matt, good morning. You know, they actually voted to drop Woodrow Wilson's name back in June, and just announced on Thursday that they were renaming the that building that previously honored Woodrow Wilson with Mellody Hobson's name. So Hobson is an alumna of Princeton University. She graduated with the class of 1991, and she had been in talks with the school about a major donation that she had planned to make. And so, you know, this is really historic for Hobson. The university said that she is becoming the first Black woman to have a residential college named after her. And this quote that she put out really sums up, you know, the historic nature of it. She says, "My hope is that my name will remind future generations of students, especially those who are Black and brown, and the first in their families, that they too belong." So it's a pretty historic step for the school and for Hobson.
Jen, thanks very much. Thanks for bringing us the stories. Jennifer Sabasaja, our Bloomberg Quick Take reporter. Joining us now is Ven Ram, Bloomberg's Markets Live currency and rates strategist. Ven, when we look at what's happening for risk assets this morning, we see a little bit of an uptick this morning, but really we've been swung left, right and centre by the conversation over stimulus. Where do we think we've got to on that stimulus conversation in the US?
Morning, Anna. So I think that, you know, we expect this kind of whiplashy nature in assets, in risk assets in the coming weeks. And if the indications that Joe Biden will become the new president strengthen, then the markets are likely to position themselves for a considerable fiscal stimulus package. That will, of course, widen the U.S. deficit, and such a package would also be inflationary. What that essentially means is that, one, the dollar will weaken, the Norwegian krone and other commodity currencies will strengthen because of their high negative betas against the dollar. Two, the Treasury curve will steepen, led by the long end, and bullet portfolio structures will do well. Three, gold will be supported as inflation expectations relative to nominal bonds will climb. And last but not the least, short expiry swaption walls may be bid. Anna, Matt?
All right, very interesting stuff, and you've got a macro view out on that today. I encourage our viewers to check it out. You also had earlier this week a forecast that 10-year yields in Italy would drop, and they have now. What happens going forward and why?
Italian bonds face a very interesting denouement in the next few weeks, Matt, and it may have nothing to do with what happens actually in the euro area. Rather, who the next occupant of White House may in fact matter more. Why do I say that? If conviction grows that a Biden victory is certain, the long end of the Treasury curve may steepen, as I was just saying. And what that means is that the German curve and Italian yield curves will also tend to steepen because of the high betas to movements in Treasuries. So a Biden victory may actually be a bit bearish for longer-dated Italian bonds over the next few weeks. Matt, Anna?
Right, so that's what we need to watch for. So as we see the 10-year horizon sort of dropping, the yields on the 10-year horizon dropping across Europe, is that the same trend then, Van? So we saw, I think it was Greece, a new all-time low yesterday. We saw the Spanish yield dropping. Is it all to do with the global picture, the White House story, rather than anything to do with Europe? Because it seems interesting that we see these yields dropping at a time where there's increasing concern about the virus spike and resurgence in Europe.
Absolutely, Anna. Because the correlations between what's happening with U.S. Treasuries and euro area curves have increased in recent weeks. And that is what is driving the narrative at the moment. And over the next few weeks until November 3, and probably slightly beyond that, I expect these correlations to last, which means that increasingly the cues will come from the U.S. and that the U.S. curve, what the U.S. curve does, will matter much more than they've previously done to euro area securities.
Ben, let me just finally ask you. Let me just finally ask you what's going on in terms of the MLive question of the day. Which assets will win as climates change? What are you hearing, and what's your take?
Well, what I hear from other investors, Matt, is that this is they find this a particularly tricky area for many investors to get a handle on, because we are still learning about the implications of climate change, and we know even less about the ripple effects it will have on specific sectors. To me, it's not clear how much of additional returns companies can generate from switching to alternative sources of energy and greener resources. In other words, are the returns commensurate enough with the capital being put to work? Things can change very quickly on this front, and we are still learning about this, and it's kind of hard to come up with hard numbers on this just yet. Matt, Anna?
Yeah, in the language of JP Morgan Asset Management, who we spoke to earlier, Ven, it'd be interesting to see if more governments move towards a carrot-based approach, so incentivizing with financial incentives for businesses and governments to take that approach. That might change the calculations. Ven, thanks so much for joining us. Ven Round, Bloomberg's Markets Live currency and rates strategist. So European equity markets, Matt, make some modest gains, and US futures, similarly, modest expectations for Friday.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll see what happens in the U.S. because futures there were higher than what we saw here in Europe. That's it for the European Open. I'm pretty sure that's it. Is that it for the European? That's it for the European Open. Stay with Bloomberg Television. Bloomberg Surveillance is up next. Anna's going to leave the shot, and she's going to go in to the radio studio.
I'm not sure why you're not here with me.
Well, you know, no one wants to look at me.
Thanks very much, Matt. That's it for
Have a great day.
European Market Open. Surveillance is next.
Shifting on stimulus, Steve Mnuchin tells Nancy Pelosi the president is once again interested in comprehensive relief bill. Robert Kaplan tells Bloomberg Fed tools cannot replace fiscal measures. Tailwinds, European stocks get a boost despite a spike in coronavirus cases across the continent. France puts more cities on maximum alert. Madrid readies for a state of emergency. And debating the debate, President Trump plans a rally on Saturday as his campaign demands an in-person showdown with Joe Biden. The commission holds firm, however, saying it must be virtual. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, this is what the markets are doing. A lot of the focus, of course, is on stimulus efforts in the U.S. There's certainly the talk that we could be closer, or at least that certainly it's back on the agenda. So this is what I'm looking at across the board. If you look at, first of all, the U.S. 10-year yield, you can see it's moving a touch, dollar declining, but it's very clear that global stocks are rising as the White House appeared to shift tack with signals it's open to a large-scale stimulus bill. Now, coming up on Surveillance, we speak to Armen Sarkisyan, that's Armenia's president. We'll talk to him at 9:30 a.m. UK time. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg. First Word News, here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. Over in the US, it's uncertain if the next presidential debate will happen. The commission that organizes it is insisting it'll be virtual, but President Trump says he won't take part in a remote debate, calling the commission a joke. He is calling for it to be rescheduled, but challenger Joe Biden is rejecting that plan. His campaign says it was the president who pulled out, not Biden. France is placing more cities on maximum alert as daily coronavirus cases exceed 18,000 for a second straight day. Restrictions are being added in Lyon, Lille and Grenoble. Bars and casinos will close and restaurants and cinemas face stricter controls. Italy, Germany and Spain have also recorded the most new daily cases since April. The U.S. is sanctioning 18 Iranian banks in a move to choke off the nation's economy. The aim is to raise pressure on Tehran to enter into a new deal, constraining its nuclear ambitions. The move had been flagged well in advance, with officials weighing it for weeks. Critics say Iran already faces so many sanctions, any more won't make much difference. And 13 men have been charged in a plot to overthrow the government of Michigan and kidnap the governor. Their alleged plan was to storm the Capitol building and try Governor Gretchen Whitmer for treason. Officials say the men staked out her vacation home and planned to destroy police vehicles with Molotov cocktails. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Leanne, thank you so much. Now, stimulus talks are back on. The White House has reversed its stance with President Donald Trump now wanting a comprehensive deal. It comes after House Speaker Nancy Pelosi pushed back on the idea of individual measures for different parts of the economy. Well, joining us to discuss all of this is Jane Foley, head of FX strategy at Rabobank. Jane, as always, thank you for joining us. It's been a pretty eventful week, certainly when it comes to U.S. politics, stimulus off, stimulus on. Will it be comprehensive or not? What does it all mean for dollar?
Well, of course, what we've seen today with the dollar is that it is softening. And, of course, that's a logical conclusion. Stimulus will be good for growth, not just in the U.S. recovery, but, of course, for the global economy, too. So so the dollar pushes down because it is, of course, a safe haven. Of course, there's other good news, too. We've seen some better data from China, the CAC and PMI, a little bit stronger, too, and some hopes that with the Golden Week holiday, which has just come to an end, and perhaps more signs that will have brought consumption in China to perhaps balance that recovery, which to date has been to do with the manufacturing sector. So some good news to absorb. But, of course, we all know that we still have lots of tests ahead, not least with the coronavirus and the greater number of cases in Europe. But still, we just don't know whether or not that election in the US will be contested or not. So plenty still to worry about.
Longer term, Jane, does the dollar go down from here?
Well, again, that very much depends on the news. But what we've seen, I think, is a fundamental shift in terms of the dollar fundamentals. As long as those Fed lines remain in place, if the swap lines, we have a huge amount of potential dollar liquidity. We're not going to get the sort of stress in the market that we had back in March. And I think with all of that liquidity there from the Fed, well, yes, the dollar fundamentals certainly have weakened. But I think we can still ask the question about really has a dollar perhaps got, or have investors got too short for the dollar? Could there be some short recovering, and I think that we can potentially see. Now, particularly, of course, if we turn to Europe now, we look at some of the news with respect to coronavirus hitting the headlines in Europe. You know, what if there are more shutdowns? What if the recovery fund doesn't prove big enough? What if there isn't a much of a coordinated response this time around? So I think for terms in positioning, that there is still the possibility that the market could have got too short for the dollar, particularly if Corona gathers pace again over the winter in the Northern Hemisphere, and particularly, of course, if that election does or ends up being contested in November.
Jane, in terms of currency pairs, where do you see the most news playing out? Is it euro dollar or is it dollar something else?
Well, I think euro-dollar is one that many people focus on, and I think there is a lot of news bubbling in Europe right now, which I don't think is particularly good news. So I think there is the possibility that we do see some scope for maybe a breakaway from the range that we've been in these last few weeks for euro-dollar. But I think, we do continue to see lots of interesting news, say, on Aussie dollar. Will the RBA cut interest rates again? Will they stimulate again? That's something interesting, and also that's driven by commodities too. But of course, the old faithful in terms of the potential for volatility is still sterling. We've still got a lot of confusion about Brexit, and also a lot of clouds gathering over Prime Minister Boris Johnson too. His popularity, of course, at a very low ebb amongst the party faithful, and lots of talks that many people in the party faithful would rather him be replaced at some point by Sunak. So even when Brexit is done and on the 1st of January, there's an awful lot to consider, both in terms of the impact of Brexit, whether or not it's smooth or not, and it certainly may not be smooth, but then on the focus on the Prime Minister himself.
Jane, thanks so much. Jane Foley there from Rabobank. Now, we'll have plenty more, of course, with Jane, and we'll also talk about the yen. Now, the Dallas Fed President, Robert Kaplan, weighed in on the stimulus debate. He spoke exclusively to Bloomberg's Kathleen Hayes.
The problem is this. The Fed has a lot of tools, and we have more things we can do, but our tools primarily ease financial conditions. They make it easier to borrow money. Our tools are not well suited when you have an income loss, and we need to make up an income loss. Borrowing more money is not going to solve their problem either. So I think the Fed can do more, and I'm sure we will look at all our options, but those aren't substitutes for fiscal policy.
Minister George said the Fed needs to give details on guidance when it comes to the Fed's intentions with regard to bond purchases to ensure effectiveness, transparency, accountability. So what's going on here? What's the question you guys are grappling with?
I'll speak for myself on that. I think we're buying still a substantial amount of bonds every month, both treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. I think we could say more about what our plans are going forward, but my own view is I right now would be hesitant to see us doing more in that area because I don't see the benefits. I could see how it would further add fuel to the financial markets. I'm more skeptical how much it would help the real economy.
Got to ask you another question that really struck me coming out of the minutes, because the minutes said that the new outcome-based forward guidance is not an unconditional commitment to a particular path. I thought you guys just said that you dissented against it, that the Fed won't be moving rates until inflation is at 2% and moving higher and you're at maximum employment. Now it sounds like there's some flexibility there, Rob. Was this a compromise that had to be reached for you guys to put out this statement and have the new forward guidance? It really seems vague and not clear still, even though you've said recently, no, there's plenty of clarity on this new framework.
Well, I think there's plenty of clarity for the next 2.5, 3 years on the path of rates. I think there's going to have to be judgments made on what we do beyond the next 2.5, 3 years. But I think it's going to take us that long to weather the pandemic and get the economy back on track. And I think until we've done that, rates are likely to stay where they are. But there's another paragraph. So there's the paragraph with the forward guidance or enhanced forward guidance. Then there's another paragraph after it, which is worth reading, which talks about financial stability and a whole range of other issues going on in the economy that we're going to be cognizant of. And my own view is we should be cognizant of. So I think listen, there will always be people who say they want more clarity, they want more transparency, but I'm a business person. I've been watching the Fed for most of my adult life. We've got pretty good visibility on what the path of rates is for the next few years. There may be some debates about asset purchases, but I think there's decent visibility there also. And I think you want the Fed to have the ability to use its judgment and adapt to overall conditions.
Why is 2% so important? You just mentioned the financial risk. That was part of your dissent. For what, 8 years when inflation couldn't get to 2% and stay there, unemployment got down to a 50-year low, GDP was growing near trend. Does it really matter that much to get to 2%, especially if you're going to take the risk of financial risk on your plate as you do so?
Well, to me, and I've said this, I'm much more interested in financial stability. So we don't want deflation, and we don't want, on the one hand, and we don't want inflation running away from us. What ideally you want is financial stability, so people can go out and have, with confidence, buy goods, businesses can transact, and not worry that we're going to either have an extreme deflation or inflation. I think it's wise for us, and I support us re-anchoring inflation expectations at 2%. But for me, the 2% by itself is not magical. It's indicative of price stability, and I think that's what we're shooting for.
Well, that was the Dallas Fed President, Robert Kaplan, speaking exclusively with Bloomberg, Kathleen Hayes. Now, coming up, a second wave versus a deeper slump. Europe's leaders face an impossible choice as they counter rapidly growing coronavirus infections. We'll discuss that next. This is Bloomberg.
It is critically important that the markets stay open in this time, as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's focus on Europe's economic recovery and the growing second wave of coronavirus infections. Now the region's lenders and leaders are ramping up efforts to force tougher local restrictions amid a surge in virus cases. France will place more cities on maximum alert after infections rose above 18,000 for a second straight day. Now we'll get more with our health reporter later in the program, but first let's discuss the impact on the region's economies. Jane, thank you so much for coming back. We're back with Jane Foley from Rabobank. When you look at the number of infections rising, not only in Europe, but also in the US and in Asia, what does that mean for how governments will have to deal with it, and what does it mean for currencies?
morning, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see, I still have an order position on Japanese yen at 105.974. We purchased, as far as I remember, yesterday. So right now I am placing an order to sell this position at 105.934. Okay. Okay. I placed an order to sell this position at the price 105.934.
Thought even just a month ago. So we do need to live with this crisis. I think most economists, investors have come to realize that. And it means that the recovery, the growth rate is going to be lower, perhaps next year, maybe the year after, as we do learn to live with this virus. And that, unfortunately, is bad news for the euro. This is a region where they have their recovery fund. And people might, again, start to look at that recovery fund and say, look, you know what? Enough, and we've got the Dutch, the Swedes, for instance, and the other members of the Frugal Four probably not wanting to allow this fund to be any bigger.
Jane, when you look at some of the haven currencies, I'm thinking of yen, I'm thinking of Swiss franc. How difficult is it to know what they'll do from now until the end of the year? How unpredictable is that trajectory?
I think once we start using the word unpredictable in terms of foreign exchange, then immediately you've got reason for people to buy some safe haven, or at least change their positioning to come away from risky currencies. I mean, if we think about risky currencies for a minute, if we think about emerging markets, what we had, in the spring when we had this big surge or the big recovery in risk appetite, we had people piling back into to emerging market currencies. We saw an awful lot of easing, monetary policy easing for a lot of emerging market countries, including quantitative easing by some. Now, if the economies are again exposed by coronavirus, those funds seem to be pulling back out again. And the fact that interest rates are much lower, again, is going to mean that there's difficulties in trying to attract those investors. So there could be some real significant problems lining up now for emerging markets. And meanwhile, investors are more likely to have longer positions in core markets, and that includes the stalwart safe havens such as the yen, the Swiss franc, and also probably the dollar.
Is there anything that emerging markets can actually do now, Jane, or specific countries to make it easier for them in the next couple of quarters?
Well, certainly a weaker dollar will help them. There's a lot of, for instance, dollar-denominated debt out there, and a weaker dollar will be beneficial to them. But certainly, you could come to an environment for some emerging market countries whereby the coronavirus potentially is gathering pace again, and they may not be able to cut interest rates because they do need to keep capital flows coming through. Now, clearly, all emerging market countries are not the same, and you've got to take, you've got to look at them all on their individual basis. But that is potentially an issue. So there are concerns, and as long as there are these sorts of concerns, it is likely that currencies like the yen, the Swiss franc, and the dollar could be firmer than they would be otherwise.
Jane, thank you so much. Jane Foley there from Rabobank stays with us. Now, coming up, more restrictions imposed across Europe as cases surge. We'll discuss that next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg Business Flash. Here in London with me is Leanne Garrett. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. Eaton Vance has surged on news that Morgan Stanley is buying the mutual fund for about $7 billion. It's the latest mega deal for CEO James Gorman after the takeover of E-Trade Financial. They are the two largest tie-ups carried out by any of the big Wall Street banks post a financial crisis. Gorman says this latest deal makes complete sense.
Eaton Vance's been around for over 90 years. World-class, huge talent, perfectly complementary businesses. There'll be very little dislocation, high growth, some great businesses with Parametrics in particular has been growing very fast. Their traditional asset management space, the Calvert funds in sustainability. So this was a no-brainer. We paid $4 for it.
And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Francine.
Leanne, thanks so much. Now, tensions are rising in Europe as numerous countries post record increases in infections. Europe's leaders are stepping up efforts to force tougher local restrictions amid a surge in coronavirus cases across the region. Now, joining us with more is Bloomberg's Chad Thomas from Berlin. Chad, numbers really rising dramatically around the continent. What can countries do about it?
Hi, Francine. Well, the numbers really are spiking everywhere you look in Europe. You have both the UK and France yesterday posting nearly 18,000 new cases in each country. And then you look at Germany, Spain, Italy, they're all at highs that we last saw in April. And even in countries in Eastern Europe, which did pretty well during that first spike, they now are also at records. What are countries doing about it? They're essentially looking at local efforts to control the virus. They're doing things on a city-by-city basis. In France yesterday, for example, they increased restrictions in 5 of the biggest cities in the country. It's the same thing playing out elsewhere where these leaders across Europe really are reluctant to go for a full-scale lockdown across the country because of the economic impact that we saw earlier in the year with those measures.
Chad, the Spanish Prime Minister, Mr. Pedro Sanchez, is said to hold an emergency cabinet meeting today. And yesterday there was a court saying that actually Madrid can't do some of the lockdowns that people were saying they could. What do we expect out of the cabinet meeting?
Yeah, Madrid is a really interesting case because, of course, they had a really difficult and tough lockdown there in the first wave. They're now experiencing a huge spike there again. And so what they had decided they were going to do was essentially have a pretty strict lockdown once again. There was a court ruling that said they couldn't move forward with that. So what the plan is that they will actually have a cabinet meeting to impose, again, these emergency powers. Those emergency powers allow the prime minister and the local government to take much stricter action. And whether that, would be challenged in court again remains to be seen.
Thank you so much. Our Chad Thomas there looking at the number of infected cases in Europe. Now, coming up, more than 300 people have died, thousands displaced. We talk, of course, about Armenia and Azerbaijan. The president of Armenia is next. This is Bloomberg.
day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
I was actually poor.
No foreplay?
Eat your bag of Lay's with a smile on your face.
If all the diseases have been taken, I'll take a tax.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get the latest on the conflict in the Caucasus. Well, more than 300 people have died and thousands have been displaced since the recent fighting broke out 2 weeks ago in Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, the region is officially part of Azerbaijan, but run by ethnic Armenians. Turkey's intervention, giving its unreserved backing to ally Azerbaijan, has raised the stakes significantly. Amid calls for ceasefire, monitors from the U.S., Russia and France have begun efforts to try and end the violence. Well, joining us now, we're delighted, is Armen Sarkisian. He's the president of Armenia. Mr. President, thank you so much for joining Bloomberg Surveillance. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, has invited parties today to try and find a ceasefire, a way forward with your foreign minister and, of course, the foreign minister on the other side. Are you confident that you will be able to reach a ceasefire?
Well, I cannot say I'm confident that we'll reach a ceasefire, because I think the two foreign ministers are going to Moscow. They're going to enter a sort of a dark room in order to start negotiating and talking about ceasefire. But I'm happy that this meeting is happening, and I'm thankful to the Russian Federation, President Putin, and Foreign Minister Lavrov organizing this meeting, because it's absolutely needed today to stop the shelling and to stop the fighting, because there are hundreds and hundreds of losses on both sides. There's a huge humanitarian crisis there, and the war is hitting civilians and so on and so forth. So thank you very much for those, which is the Minsk Group co-chairs, Russian government. And I hope they will get the ceasefire.
But, President, is Russia really the only power here that can broker an agreement? And, you know, do you need Russia's support? Have you spoken to President Putin?
Well, to make it clear, this is one of those conflicts that has a framework where it can take negotiators to the peace finally. This is the Minsk Group of OSCE, which was created more than 20 years after the first war of Nagorno-Karabakh was over, and sides were negotiating the peaceful outcome and the future status of Nagorno-Karabakh. But for this or that reason, Azerbaijan, on the 27th of September, decided that they will not go the path of peace or negotiations. They decided that they can solve it with arms and armaments. And of course, Turkish involvement was very crucial here.
Yeah, but do you want Russia's support in this? And have you had any contacts with Vladimir Putin since the crisis began?
Well, we have regular contacts with Vladimir Putin, but on our side, on the Minsk platform, the negotiators are the prime minister and the foreign minister. On the other side is the president and their foreign minister. So the person who is regularly in contact with President Putin is my prime minister, because he is in charge also the event on the Armenian side, not on the Nagorno-Karabakh side, because they have the president of their own. So prime minister is there, and I have my own regular contacts during my years of presidency with President Putin. But again, the platform is the Minsk Group.
Okay, you've accused Turkey of military involvement in support of Azerbaijan, something, President, that they deny. Do you have proof that this has happened? Have you showed proof to France and NATO allies, and what have you asked them to do?
Well, basically, I no longer need, neither me or my government or my ministers need to present proofs, because proofs are there. They are in the form of recognized announcement by the Azeri side, Azeri officials, videos, photos, computer sites, everything. And even foreign intelligence organizations or departments of several countries, including Russia, have reported the presence of terrorists, Islamic terrorists on the territory of Azerbaijan that were brought there by Turkey. And the presence of Turkish military, Turkish drones, even F-16s that are used now in the battle as well.
But so what have you asked NATO allies to do in response to this? Have you asked them for a response?
Well, I've made it clear, and I have asked the NATO to look at this very carefully, because we have a situation where a member of NATO, an organization that has clear mandate what to do, a NATO member is taking part or getting involved in a conflict of third parties, which are not NATO members. And does Turkey have an authorization or a green light from NATO? And if yes, we should know that. If not, then I hope that our colleagues in NATO will make their voice heard and put pressure on Turkey that they should not get involved into this conflict, because their presence here is not helping at all. It's even complicating that dramatically.
President, Azerbaijan says it's fighting to regain its own internationally recognized territory, and that 30 years of talks haven't actually yielded much. Why would they not be allowed to do that?
Well, they will not be allowed of killing people or starting a war? What's the question? And then I'll try to answer in a different form. Well, you have negotiations, and negotiations in, let's say, more than 20 years have achieved a lot. They have achieved a lot in a form that the scope and the scale of questions that sides have to negotiate is huge, tremendous. During these 20 years, they have come to a couple of very important ones that needed political decision. So the work was done very hard. In the meantime, there were changes of negotiators on both sides. On Armenian side, there were 3 presidents before involved, and now the prime minister who is in charge of negotiating. So if you are a bit unhappy with negotiations, what do? You start a war, or you start continuing, because negotiating process with a complex story is a very, very tough job. And then what is the alternative? The alternative is death of people, basically destroying infrastructure and creating a big uncertainty in the whole region. So I don't think that we have exhausted all of the possibilities, and the time is to return back to negotiations. But in order to do that, I think one of the important steps is to make sure that Turkey is no longer involved there. It's just between Azerbaijan and the people of Nagorno-Karabakh and the Republic of Artsakh. Yes, please.
And President, the Prime Minister of Armenia said that it may consider the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh as a response to the conflict. Would that stop the fighting? And under what circumstances would that be done? Under what circumstances would you actually recognize independence?
Well, it forces me to take you back a little bit into history. First of all, Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh is a historic Armenia, part of historic Armenia, historic land, mountainous, beautiful region where Armenians used to live, and they still live for thousands of years. And the day they became Christian, or with all Armenians in the year 301, there are churches there, monuments, and so on and so forth. It was only for 70 years this region was given as an autonomous region under Azerbaijan. It was given by Comrade Stalin, so there was nothing. It was the divide and rule theory. And after the breakdown of Soviet Union, I'm coming to your question very quickly.
Okay.
After the breakdown of Soviet Union, the first war and 30 years of negotiations. So what is claiming the Azeri side is they want to free that territory. Freeing from whom? There are ethnic Armenians, 100% living there, so you are freeing from them. In my vocabulary, it's named, the word is ethnic cleansing. So we want the land without Armenians. In the case of Armenians, they are fighting for their life, for their heritage, for their religion, and for what they believe, and their houses, and their parents and children. So these are 2 different approaches to the same problem.
No, I understand, President, but my question was, would you consider independence? Or under no circumstances would you do that?
Yes. Let me give the answer here, and the answer is clear. From the day one of the First World War was over in and ceasefire was established in 1994, there was, of course, on the table the question: should Armenia and other states, and asking other states to recognize the independence of Republic of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. But the Armenian side, taking into account that there is a negotiating process, the Minsk group with the three great coaches, we restrained ourselves, giving a chance for negotiations to come to a final conclusion on the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. But if this war continues, probably Armenia will not be left with any other choice rather than recognize the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh and ask the world community, international community, to recognize as well.
All right. President, thank you so much for your time today. Armen Sarkisyan there, the president of Armenia. Now, coming up, why a Grammy Award-winning rapper is launching a digital bank. We hear from Michael Render of Greenwood Financial. He tells us he's trying to address years of inequality in banking. This is Bloomberg.
As we grow, banking is coming right into our telephones. My 13-year-old banks through her phone. I bank still by going into brick and mortar places, and as they take brick and mortar places out of our community, we seem to be lost. Greenwood is bringing your bank right to your lap, right in your home. You're available to do not only savings and deposits. Their hope and goal is to grow into a lender for automobiles, for homes. Homes is the first step, the first sign and piece of wealth that many first-generation Americans or many first-generation enter into homeowners can leave to their children.
Well, that was Grammy Award-winning rapper Michael Render discussing the launch of Greenwood, a new digital bank that he and a group of Black American businessmen have developed to serve local communities. Now, the 50 richest Americans now hold almost as much wealth as half of the U.S. population. New data from the Federal Reserve suggests that COVID-19 has transformed the economy in ways that have disproportionately rewarded a small class of billionaires. Now, the central bank has taken a look at U.S. wealth through the first half of 2020, and it has shown stark disparities by race, age, and class. Now, for more on this, we're delighted to be joined by Jennifer Sabazaja, our Bloomberg Quick Take reporter. Jen, great to have you for these, very, very important discussions. What more did the breakdown of this Fed data actually reveal?
Yeah, so Francine, you know, this latest Fed data, I think, really just provides more evidence into this K-shaped recovery that we've been talking about now for a few weeks. So as you mentioned, the top 1% of Americans are now worth just as much as about half of the population here in the U.S. That's about 165 million people. So according to this data, the top 1%, their combined net worth sits at about $32.4 trillion. Compare that with the bottom 50% of Americans who hold just a bit over $2 trillion. And as you mentioned at the top, that's just about how much just 50 of the richest people in America are worth. 50. You know, so that's just a breakdown based on class. When you look at race and age, the disparities are even more stark. So it's pretty surprising, some of this data that the Fed found. And one of the reasons why they found this, you know, widening gap is because a majority of Americans just aren't benefiting from the stock market. You know, they haven't been able to get the same exposure to it as wealthier Americans who now own more than 50% of the equity in corporations. So, Francine, you know, a new stimulus bill is really needed to help these Americans who have been struggling now for several months.
Jennifer, Princeton has also named a residential college after finance executive Mellody Hobson. What's the story there?
Yeah, so, you know, for years, students had been trying to get the school to rename this college named after Woodrow Wilson. And now on Thursday, Princeton announced that they're going to name it after Mellody Hobson. And so Hobson is a Princeton alum. She graduated there in 1991, and she had been talking with the school about a major donation that she and her husband, George Lucas, had planned to make. And so now the newly named Hobson College is going to replace Wilson College starting in 2023, I believe. But, you know, back in June, the school voted to actually rename the Wilson College. And so it's pretty exciting for Hobson because she becomes the university's first Black woman to have a residential college named after her. It's pretty significant. And this quote that she put out really underscores how historic it is. She says, "My hope is that my name will remind future generations of students, especially those who are Black and brown, and the first in their families, that they too belong." So it's pretty exciting for the school and for Hobson herself.
Yeah, it's very exciting. Jennifer, thanks so much. Jennifer Zabazaja there, our Bloomberg Quick Take reporter. Now, it's also time for the investor community to step up and drive change collectively. That's the message from Farah Foustouk, the Lazard Gulf Chief Executive and co-chair of the B20 Women in Business Action Council. Along with talking about diversity, I also spoke to her about the outlook for markets in the Middle East.
We invest across the whole Middle East. So we include Saudi Arabia. Saudi is clearly the largest market in the region. It's about 55% of the index. So we invest in Saudi and all other markets. We don't just invest in Saudi. And we basically build our portfolio from a bottom-up perspective.
Are there an opportunity? So if you look at the MENA markets, so let's exclude Saudi, they've had quite a big correction due to the exposure, for example, for oil. Is this the right time to go in and pick some of these things up?
I think you're kind of seeing a differentiation between some of the markets in the Middle East. You have countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or Kuwait that have rallied, that are on higher levels of valuation, but you've also had an increase in liquidity in some of these markets. And then you have Dubai, Oman, and Egypt, which haven't seen the same moves, who on evaluation are relatively more interesting, who have pockets of value. And so you have that differentiation between the two markets. There are definitely opportunities. The question is finding those opportunities. It's more selective. It's more, we believe, a fundamental analysis. And it's really looking at understanding the drivers of these companies.
Farah, if you look at the changing role of women in the Middle East private sector, how has that increased and how much will COVID-19 actually be a setback?
So I think COVID-19 around the world has been a very tough time for many women. I think it's created more disparities. I think it's been a real challenge for many women with children working at home. You know, we've both experienced this. And I think also if you look at the positive side, I think it's realizing that equality starts at home and there needs to be a shared interest at home, a shared responsibility at home for women to be able to have these opportunities in the workforce. So, I mean, as a woman in the Middle East, I feel very impressed and very proud of many of the women I meet and have met over the last 15 years who are phenomenally equipped, intelligent, determined and able to succeed, but we also need to fix the system.
Well, that was Farah Fustok, the Lazard Gulf Chief Executive and co-chair of B20 Women in Business Action Council. Now let's take a look at the markets. Overall, a lot of optimism, or at least some optimism, about stimulus in the U.S. We saw that between the Democrats and the Republicans. We'll have plenty more on that throughout the day. You can see U.S. 10-year yields at 0.76. This is Bloomberg.
Climate change is the defining issue of our time, so we've redefined how we cover it. With clear data and rigorous journalism, we rise to the scale of the challenge to reveal the breadth of possibility. We look at stories from every angle to provoke debate, spotlight solutions, and make sense of the greatest crisis of our generation. Bloomberg Green, solutions for a changing climate.
It is critically important that the markets stay open in this time, as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, Joe Biden will hold a town hall with voters on October 15th to make up for a scheduled debate that President Donald Trump said he will not attend because it was going to be virtual. Now, joining us with the very latest is Bloomberg's Kathleen Hunter. Kathleen, always great to get you because there's so much going on, in the lead up to the election. How will this affect the presidential campaigns?
Well, I think that, after we saw the results of the first debate, which was, epically chaotic, and, I think a lot of people were put off by the performance that they saw from both candidates. And so in that regard, it's not surprising, particularly we're seeing that, particularly given that we're seeing that Trump's, there was some negative blowback for Trump in some of the polls that were conducted after the first debate. Given that, I think it's not surprising that the president has made the decision essentially not to compete in this, or not to take part in this second now virtual debate. And given that, I think that it makes sense for both sides to kind of go back to their, well, not make sense from a political standpoint, makes sense for both sides to go back to their respective corners and hold their own events. In fact, I was thinking about this last week, even before Trump's coronavirus diagnosis. And, myself and others were really questioning what whether the American public would be well served by a second debate that was similar to the first, where there was just lots of interruptions and not a lot of substantive policy discussion.
Kathleen, the president says he wants to hold a rally in Florida on Saturday. Would this be possible? I mean, he says actually he's gotten the all clear from his doctors.
Yeah, so I think possible is really defined by Trump at this point. I think that, there's certainly concern still that, Trump and people around him might still be infected and or contagious. There's obviously been concern out there that the doctors that are treating Trump have maybe been subjected to some political pressure to try to clear him. Certainly we know that last weekend when they were giving updates on his health, that those updates were being reviewed and, potentially edited by Trump himself. And so, I think there's a lot of questions out there about whether or not it's really safe for the president himself to be around, people at a rally, so soon after his diagnosis. That being said, beyond the president, it's also hard to imagine how this would be really safe given, the number of people in Trump's orbit that have become infected in the last week to 10 days. Obviously, we still don't know the full extent of that. And so I think there's a lot of questions about whether or not this event, like the event we saw in Tulsa, Oklahoma over the summer, like we suspect from the event 2 Saturdays ago where Amy Coney Barrett, the Supreme Court nominee, was named. We know that those events, have contributed to the spread of a virus. And I think there's, a clear sense that that could be the case, at this next rally.
When you look at, Kathleen, at some of the things that, are pretty incredible, really, in this news cycle, if you look at Michigan, the FBI busting a plot to kidnap the governor. What do we actually know about that?
Yeah, so this is a bit of a, kind of, as you say, very just, remarkable news that surfaced yesterday that there was this attempt underway to try to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, who is a Democrat and someone who, has been critical of the president. She was on the short list for being Joe Biden's running mate. I think her positions when it comes to coronavirus and the lockdown that was undertaken earlier this year in Michigan have really made her a target of some of the pro-Trump movement and also some of the sort of more extreme white supremacist militia groups. And so the fact that, the FBI was able to break this up, I think is obviously a good thing. But, this is the kind of news story that, I think for a lot of Americans and a lot of people across the world really kind of gave them pause to say, wait, like this seems to be a very extreme example. And of course, we're already hearing Trump's opponents, tying it to the type of rhetoric that he's put out there. Of course, that's something the White House will push back against. But I think there's a sense, and, the governor herself is blaming Trump and his rhetoric for contributing to the type of atmosphere that would lead to something like this.
Thank you so much. Kathleen Hunter there with the very latest, of course, on the trail to November 3rd. Now, this is what the markets are looking at. The markets suddenly are focusing on the stimulus again, but this time with a positive bit of news that the president is looking possibly at a comprehensive deal. Will we get something? Markets up. European stocks gaining some 0.3%. Coming up, more surveillance.
another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television. Shifting on stimulus, Steve Mnuchin tells Nancy Pelosi the president is once again interested in a comprehensive relief bill. Robert Kaplan tells Bloomberg Fed tools cannot replace fiscal measures. Tailwinds, European stocks get a boost despite a spike in coronavirus cases across the continent. France puts more cities on maximum alert. Madrid readies for a state of emergency. And debating the debate, President Trump plans a rally on Saturday as his campaign demands an in-person showdown with Joe Biden. The commission holds firm, however, saying it must be virtual. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lack in London, Tom Keene in New York. Tom, it's Friday. We got through the week, a number of interesting stories, though, across economics, finance, and, of course, politics. We look at the U.S. election. You know, we're 26 days away from that, so we need to always take a look at the polls and the latest news from the president. And then we also have this big news regarding Borsa Italiana and Euronext. That was confirmed.
we've got the news in Europe. Yesterday was extraordinary, Francine. We're still regrouping here in New York from the news flow yesterday of transactions and, of course, of the President of the United States. I think the number one breaking story here in the zeitgeist of the East Coast is the president appears to be healthy, and the real decision for him today is, does he do a rally tomorrow in one of these key battleground states? That seems to be the topic du jour.
Yeah, if he's not infectious, Tom, it'd be, probably a record-setting recovery. So we'll have a look at that. Now, let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News in New York City. Here's Ritika Gupta. Hi, Ritika.
Morning, Francine. Tom, the White House is once again shifting its position on a stimulus package. Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin told House Speaker Nancy Pelosi the administration now wants an agreement on a large-scale relief bill. Earlier this week, the president pulled his negotiators from talks on comprehensive legislation. Meanwhile, Federal Reserve officials are keeping up the pressure on Washington to renew fiscal support for the economy. Dallas Fed President Robert Kaplan tells Bloomberg he sees a slower economy without more stimulus. Boston Fed President Eric Rosengren favors increasing the Fed's asset purchases, but says that's not as good as other relief packages. Louisiana is bracing today for Hurricane Delta. The storm has picked up strength and is now a Category 3 with winds up to 120 miles an hour. It's expected to slam into an area of Louisiana still recovering from Hurricane Laura. The hurricane has forced energy companies to shut down almost all the oil production in the Gulf of Mexico and most of the gas output. China has joined the World Health Organization's vaccine effort. It's filling a void in global health leadership after President Trump spurned the program. The $18 billion COVAX initiative aspires to give lower-income countries the same access to the coronavirus vaccines as wealthier nations. Global News 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Ritika, thanks so much. On equities, bonds, currencies, commodities, a couple backstories here that I think are important. Futures up 14, Dow futures up 98. Equity markets just simply lift. And the story of the week week is the VIX coming in 29-ish down to 26.05 right now. I do want to point out two things beneath the radar. One is Chinese renminbi with a jump condition stronger this morning. The yuan to 6.71 right now on the Chinese yuan on the screen. There's 6.7063. That really bears some watching as well. And the other is continued disinflation, Francine, is seen in the data in Europe. I'd really look at the Swiss 20-year with that negative yield of negative 0.274. It really indicates a continued disinflation pressure in Europe.
Yeah, Tom, a lot of the focus, of course, is on that. When you look at the Swiss National Bank, it also has other concerns, regarding the treatment of women in certain cases. So we need to also just look at how that may reshape SNB going forward. I'm looking at some of the things that could move. I'm looking at, a lot of the emerging markets, Mexican peso beating some of the emerging peers in the past 3 months. But overall, there seems to be better news about the stimulus, and so that's filtering through to Europe. And then you can see renminbi 6.70 as well, Tom.
Very good. There's lots going on right now. One of them is the Nobel Peace Prize. Of course, it is always a political football. And this year, it is what is called the WFP, or the World Food Program. I'll be honest, I'm not all that up to speed on this, but it is something to honor and something we will look at through the day. The World Food Program, of course, in a time of extraordinary need worldwide. Francine?
Yeah, amongst the other favorites, Tom, that I think people thought that could win the Nobel Peace Prize, I think you had Greta Thunberg, but also Jacinda Ardern, that, coming out in the last couple of minutes, the World Food Program has won the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, Europe's leaders are ramping up efforts for tougher local restrictions amid a surge in virus cases. Numerous countries have post-record increases in infections and cases in Italy, for example, with cases in Italy hitting a 6-month high. Well, joining us now from Milan is Ferdinando Giuliano. He's our Bloomberg opinion columnist. Ferdinando, when you look at some of the lockdown measures and some of the things that actually we look at, country to country, why are infection rates going up so much? Have people relaxed too much, or is it just the nature, given we're going into winter?
Well, I think it's the million-dollar question, which we haven't been able to answer so far, and I think we're still struggling with. I mean, there are a number of hypotheses. One is just that as the winter is coming into the autumn, and then we're moving into the winter in Europe, people are spending more time indoor, and that's obviously helping the outbreak. The other question is over schools, which have reopened across the continent, in Italy very recently, and so they may be contributing to spreading the virus. And then, yes, there many doctors are saying that people were a bit too relaxed during the summer, and that helped to, make the virus spread more easily. And then this got brought into communities and families. And what we're seeing is still the long wave of what happened during the European summer. So lots of hypotheses, but we don't know really yet.
Ferdinando, you're a great student of this across the continent of Europe. What are the best practices of Italy that we're not seeing in Spain, we're not seeing in France?
Well, look, I think Italy's made a good effort at the so-called track and tracing system, i.e. making sure that once you identify someone with the virus who's positive to the test, you go and trace all the contacts of that person and try to really constrain the outbreak. This is something which Germany has been doing exceptionally well during the first wave, and which it seemed that Italy had picked up for this second wave. But unfortunately, numbers are picking up in Italy as well. So some wonder whether, Italy was just a bit luckier than other countries in the second wave, and is now unfortunately catching up with the likes of Spain and France and the UK, which are far ahead in this very sorry race we are seeing.
Ferdinando, what are politicians worried about now? I mean, there's a general lassitude, right? They worry that it's hitting morale, and they worry about their economies as well. What are the kind of conversations that are going behind the scenes, and how different are these from what we heard back in March?
Well, I think the concern now is that, politicians don't think people are ready, willing, or able to withstand a new lockdown. Now, I've argued before that a lockdown isn't really a choice for politicians. If you end up with your hospitals overwhelmed, if you're incapable of, taking care not just of the COVID patients, but all patients, then you will end up with more draconian measures. But politicians really want to try and avoid it. Also because, the economy went through a very difficult phase over the spring, started recovering during the summer. But if we have a new hit, people are wondering, how long you can keep, for example, businesses on life support, how long you can extend these furlough schemes for. So a new round of draconian restrictions is going to, be extremely hard to withstand.
Who is winning, if anyone, the tourist war? The images I see, typically, Fernando, on Instagram, is of an empty Europe. Is there some place actually winning the tourist war in this natural disaster?
Look, this is a very fascinating question, one which I watched live, during the summer. Some restaurants in Italy, for example, did exceptionally well, and these are the restaurants catering locals, Italians. Italians still went on holiday, but instead of going to, Turkey or Spain or Greece, they stayed in Italy. And those restaurants which serve Italian customers had a really, really good year. Those hotels, which, for example, serve American tourists, there are some wonderful hotels, for example, in the Amalfi Coast, they were completely empty. So even within a single country, you saw a total bifurcation of the economy. Some restaurant owners have told me this has been the best year in decades. Others were really, really struggling because they couldn't sell their rooms they would normally sell to, foreign tourists. So again, this is an example that the COVID hit is hitting businesses in a very unequal manner.
Ferdinando, thank you so much. Ferdinando Giuliano of Bloomberg Opinion. Tom, it was interesting when I was actually in Liguria back in August. It was the people that we always see over there was saying that it's not that they couldn't fill rooms, is that they filled the rooms with Italians instead of Americans. But Americans apparently spend, 2/3 more of an Italian tourist in a week. Yeah, funny.
Yeah, on the regression equation of that, the first factor, AX, is the distance to the nearest Gucci store. That's how that 2/3 bump goes.
Yeah, that's just the Keen chart. Tom, we'll have...
you go across St. Mark's Square, and you go down this little cubby hole behind Bottega, and then the Nirvana beckons you, or in Florence, there's that
tour guide.
Gucci Garden. We need to do a remote. When this is all over, Francine, you and me, Gucci Garden in Florence. It'll work.
Yeah, we'll always talk Italian fashion.
Gucci
also coming
Garden.
Up, though, we'll talk emerging markets. Tu Nguyen, a Commerzbank FX strategist. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
Some things you see coming. Some things you don't. The trick is to be ready for anything.
John from Infrastructure Support is working every day to keep essential market data flowing seamlessly. We keep on, so you can keep on.
We want to help the airline workers. There is legislation that we had in the CARES Act, which we hope that we could continue for another 6 months or so. That expired the end of September. We can do that separately, but we cannot do it unless there's a big bill. So it could be part of a big bill, or it could be separate from a big bill from a timing standpoint.
Well, that was House Speaker Nancy Pelosi speaking about stimulus negotiations with Bloomberg's David Weston. Now, to talk about emerging markets, but to talk a lot more also about dollar and what that means for emerging markets, joining us is Tulan Yuen, Commerzbank FX Strategies. Tulan, thank you for joining us. We used to talk about emerging markets and talk about structural reform. We used to talk about exactly what countries would do better than others. Now it links it back to dollar. What does dollar do from now until 2021?
Our expectations is that the dollar will continue to weaken because of several factors. For one, obviously we hope for fading of the corona crisis eventually, probably only by the middle of next year, but still this is one of our expectations. So the dollar should weaken on reduced safe haven flows, but more importantly we expect the dollar to weaken because of monetary policy. We've seen this large shift in the Fed strategy, which will boost inflation in the longer term. And this is a significant move which should weigh on the US dollar. Obviously, at the moment it is not as much of a burden because of the corona crisis, and the likelihood of inflation overshooting at this point seems rather low, but it will certainly become a burden for the dollar over the longer term.
Tulan, what's the emerging market currency that actually can decouple from dollar? Is there anything that looks attractive at the moment because it's not so much linked to possible dollar weakness?
There are a couple in the short term which look quite attractive, mostly in the Asian region. I mean, we've seen the renminbi doing exceptionally well in the last couple of weeks and months, obviously because the region seems to be a lot further out already when it comes to the economic recovery. And now, for example, with respect to China, we've seen after the holiday, for example, that domestic travel has picked up significantly there, and this is obviously quite encouraging. So in the short term, I would say that some of the Asian currencies will be more of on the outperforming side.
Tulan, good morning. Tom Keene in New York. I want to go to renminbi here, which on a monthly chart is out 2 standard deviations and really is a substantial jump condition this morning. Stronger yuan. Do you frame out at Commerzbank that we could get a sea change in renminbi where we've broken its depreciation and that it strengthens out and even begins to approach 6 yuan per dollar?
I mean, certainly with the moves we've seen recently, the chances of that scenario have increased. But our base case still is that this is only a temporary rally that we're seeing, because it's still in the interest of the Chinese government to have a depreciation trend in the renminbi. Because if we remember, before the corona crisis, the Chinese economy was already on a weakening trend because of structural issues. And these structural issues, they have not disappeared. So I think the Chinese government will still try to gear the renminbi more towards a weakening trend.
Okay, this is important. What is pushing, if we begin...
in the short term...
Yeah, but Tulan, if we begin with the idea that it is in some ways a controlled and constructively manipulated currency with a collar, etc., that it's not truly float, what's pushing against the Chinese if they desire a weaker renminbi?
I think it's currently the fact that the region is doing extremely well. I mean, right, it seems that China has contained the virus. This stands in clear contrast to what we're seeing in Europe, as well as in the US, where infection rates are picking up again as well. So I think this is more of a short-term trade that we're seeing, because it seems that probably the economic recovery in China and the Asian region will be much further ahead, at least in the short term. But I think it's, as I say, it's a short-term trade, which makes sense. But over the medium to longer term, I don't think this will play out, betting on a stronger renminbi. But I think there are some investors who see some opportunities now, at least for the next quarter or the next 2 quarters at least.
So, Julian, that's shorter term. What happens to the Chinese economy longer term? And actually, if you look at some of the pitfalls over there, you know, are you worried about default? Are you worried about the middle class not doing as well as the you know, people that have more money in China?
Yes, I mean, one of the structural issues that the economy has been facing already before the corona crisis was that of high leverage within the economy, because there's so much capital bottled up within China, and this is leading to bubbles here and there. We've seen it in the real estate market in China. And one of the aims of the Chinese government has always been to start deleveraging the economy. This obviously this problem has been strengthened by the corona crisis, because obviously because of the cyclical downturn, the central bank, the government, they had to increase leverage again. But this is still a medium to long term issue, and we've seen already before the corona crisis, as you say, some defaults here and there, financial stability being rocked, and so this is an issue that they will have to tackle once this corona crisis is over, and therefore we will see a more tight policy probably in this area. This should weigh on growth over the medium term.
Tulan, this has been very beneficial here with renminbi moving. Tulan Nguyen really changing gears there, only she can do, with Commerce Bank on renminbi. It's a jump condition, taking strength back to where we were 2019. We're nowhere near the 2018 strength. It was so emotional for President Trump, but nevertheless stronger renminbi today. The Nobel Peace Prize is the World Food Program of the United Nations. This has been a concerted effort by the United Nations since the 1960s. I've had interviews over the years with David Daw, particularly on rice, and just the simple idea of rice is a staple for so much of the world. Today, the Nobel Peace Prize emits this vaccine to the United Nations and their World Food Program. No doubt that will be a topic with El Arian, Dr. El Arian of Allianz and the University of Cambridge. El Arian in the 9 o'clock hour. Futures up 13, Dow Futures up 96. This is Bloomberg.
has been interrupted. Uninterrupted service is peace of mind. Kimmy from customer support is responding to a 500% increase in daily call volume, no matter what. We keep on, so you can keep on.
Valuations, particularly, sort of the technology landscape, have gotten to some pretty extraordinary levels. So I think it's not a surprise. I don't think it's any indication of the beginning of the end, but I do think markets don't like uncertainty.
This is a market that, over the past few weeks, has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Riska Gupta with the Bloomberg Business Flash. There could be a $30 billion takeover in the chip-making industry. Bloomberg has learned that Advanced Micro Devices is in talks to buy Xilinx. The deal could come together as early as next week. A combination of AMD and Xilinx could break Intel's stranglehold on the market for data center computer components. And the London Stock Exchange Group has agreed to sell Borsa Italiana to Euronext and to Italian lenders. The price, more than $5.1 billion. LSE is selling the Italian exchange so it can get EU approval for its $27 billion purchase of Refinitiv. By adding Borsa Italiana, Euronext will have about a quarter of all equity trading in Europe. And that's your latest Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom, Francine.
Thank you so much, Ritika. This is what the markets are doing. Now, the focus on the markets, of course, on that extra stimulus that could come from the U.S., but they're also looking at the number of infections of COVID-19 rising in Europe. So if you look at, for example, some of the European bonds, they're rising. Italy's 10-year yield falling to a record low, and treasuries gaining, the dollar retreating, Tom.
Very good. After Francine's important interview with the leadership of Armenia and all those tensions, Turkish lira 7.93 today. It's been an ugly week for Turkish lira. Futures up 14, Dow futures up 98 as well. Please stay with us. On Bloomberg Markets Today, the close, Mr. Meinert of Guggenheim. Good morning.
Give you a sense of the real-time action, the 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
I think I'm going to try doing a rally on Saturday night if we have enough time to put it together. But we want to do a rally in Florida, probably in Florida on Saturday night. Might come back and do one in Pennsylvania in the following night, and it's incredible what's going on. I feel so good. I will say this, that it's a very sad thing. Now you have this debate commission. It's a joke. We'll see what happens, but no, I'm not interested in doing a virtual. I'm not Joe Biden. I'm not going to do a virtual debate, sit behind a computer screen.
It is an original election. Maria Bartiromo over at Fox Business yesterday with the president for at least 55 minutes that we monitored here. Thank you to our great headline team for bringing those headlines of a recovering president of the United States. There's any number of themes on a Friday morning, some 20-some days to the election, X number of days to a non-debate. In the chaos, there's only one person to speak to. Stephanie Baker pulled the short straw and joins us now, our senior writer for Bloomberg News. Stephanie, to be blunt, this is what the president loves. He's healed. He's got a message. He's doing Fox. He's going to go out and rally. Is it going to work? Is it a 2016 redux?
You know, he's so behind in the polls that he's got to stage something to change the nature of the conversation and get back into get back into the debate. And the fact that he has refused to participate in this virtual debate, the terms of which Biden has agreed to, and he has refused, saying he doesn't want to do a virtual debate. Now it looks like ABC is going to do a town hall with Biden alone. At least that's what they've announced.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah.
Whether or not, Trump will change his mind, I think most people think it's a risk for him not to participate in this debate when he's so behind in the polls. It'll make, it gives the Democrats the opportunity to say that he is perhaps too scared to debate, but he's the one who needs it. He's the one that's behind.
But within the clock and getting to October 15th, if we presume there was a third debate, he's going to have 5, 7, 10 days to regroup for a third debate that may not be virtual, right?
Right. So I think that the next debate after, and the third final debate is on the 29th of October, scheduled to be. And, that doesn't give him much time before the election, on November 3rd to catch up. And if you look at the polls, I mean, he's behind in a number of swing states, if you believe the polls as they stand. And he's pulling out all sorts of, last-minute stops, releasing these Russia documents, attacking his members of his own cabinet, including Attorney General William Barr for not prosecuting Obama and Biden for, allegedly monitoring spying on his election campaign in 2016. So he's kind of grasping at straws, looking for something that could perhaps change the course of this election in the final stretch.
What would change the course of the election, Stephanie? Is it just a matter of who shows up to vote on November 3rd?
Well, if you remember, at this time in the 2016 election was the Access Hollywood tape that was released, which many thought was he'd never recover from. And then after that, there was the whole issue around Hillary Clinton's emails, which did seem to change the nature of the debate. He seems to be trying to stage a repeat of that, but I think it's going to be very hard for him to do that. People are already voting. There's a lot more early voting going on now. So I think it would be much harder to try to change the course of the debate this late. And he seems to be, harming himself by some of the comments that he's making on coronavirus, saying that it's not that bad. He's got through it on the same day that 1,000 people in the U.S. died from COVID. It strikes me as, tone deaf, given what's going on in the country. Likewise with the, refusal to kind of push ahead with the stimulus talks. Why would you, stop the the chance to provide, stimulus to the country right before voters go to the polls. It doesn't make any sense.
But Stephanie, and yet the Republican Party are sticking with the president, or is there, I feel like I've asked you this a handful of times over the last 4 years. We're so close to the election, so maybe it's different, but are they still, supporting the president because they want to or because they have no choice?
Well, yeah, of course they're supporting the president, in the run-up today. They don't really have a choice. But, I did note comments by Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, yesterday saying that he hadn't been to the White House since August 6th because he wasn't confident in the protocols in place to protect people from coronavirus, and that they did not match the guidance that they were providing in the Senate, which I thought was an extraordinary criticism of the White House and Trump about how he has handled the COVID pandemic within the White House itself. So, I mean, you see these little moments of departures, but, this is no major policy departure. They're going to push ahead with the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, or at least attempt to do that before November 3rd. We'll see if all these COVID cases get in the way and slow it down.
I have 8 more questions, but no time. Stephanie Baker, thank you so much for joining us. Look forward to speaking to you numerous times, too. This election, really extraordinary. Futures up 13, Dow futures up 93 on a Friday as we look at all of the news flow, including the business transactions yesterday. With our first written news in New York City, here's Ritika Gupta.
Thanks, Tom. The Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to the World Food Programme. The United Nations agency was honored for its efforts to combat hunger and food insecurity around the globe. Looks like the on-again, off-again talks for a large-scale stimulus bill are back on again. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin told House Speaker Nancy Pelosi that President Trump now wants a comprehensive relief package. Earlier this week, the president ended talks and said they wouldn't resume until after the election. And President Trump says he feels really good and hopes to hold a campaign rally in Florida on Saturday. The White House doctor has given him the go-ahead for public engagement starting this weekend. It was a week ago today that the president was hospitalized with the coronavirus. And the Justice Department has sued Yale University, claiming it illegally discriminates against white and Asian American applicants. The lawsuit claims the school favors Black and Hispanic students in undergraduate admissions. The Trump administration had previously threatened Yale to stop considering an applicant's race or national origin. Yale responded that it would not abandon its race-conscious process. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Thank you so much, Ritika. Now, coming up next, we'll talk Turkey. We'll also, of course, talk about some of the other emerging markets with Murat Olgun, HSBC Head of Global EM Research. This is Bloomberg.
When opportunity knocks at the door, don't say, blimey, I've still got my pajamas on. Say yes to stuff and it will take you interesting places.
We're clearly going through some very unusual times and, enormous difficulties getting groups of people to agree on things.
From Bloomberg's European headquarters in the City of London, join us on Leaders with LACWA.
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flicked the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean? Combustion engines get electrified.
A NATO member is taking part or getting involved in a conflict of third parties, which are not NATO members. And does Turkey have an authorization or a green light from NATO? And if yes, we should know that. If not, then I hope that our colleagues in NATO will make their voice heard and put pressure on Turkey that they should not get involved into this conflict, because their presence here is not helping at all.
Well, that was Armen Sarkisian, the president of Armenia, speaking to us a little bit earlier on. Now, according to a new HSBC survey, also investors are warming up to emerging markets. Almost half of investors surveyed by the bank are bullish on EM over the next 3 months, and 71% are betting on growth to accelerate in the coming year. Asia has most favorable outlook across all assets. Well, joining us now to talk about Turkey and to talk about emerging markets as a whole, Murat Olgun, HSBC Global Head of EM Research. Murat, great to have you on the program. I want to go back to our interview with the Armenian president. I mean, he was very clear in saying, look, Turkey shouldn't interfere. He's asked, NATO members to kind of look into exactly what's happening. And because of these geopolitical tensions, we saw another low for Turkish lira. What's your call on Turkish lira 3 months from now?
Well, to be honest, our forecast is actually lower than this level because, for one thing, when you look at macro, obviously, Turkey is probably going to be one of the countries which will have a much faster recovery from the COVID shock. That has created some increase in credit growth and some widening in current account deficit. But the fiscal is a good situation. The public debt is much lower, and authorities have already taken measures, tightening liquidity, special consumption tax hike, and I think this will have an impact on credit growth, slow it down a bit, I think there will be some improvement in imbalances going into 2021. So we've already seen a lot of measures being taken.
But if you look at some of the other geopolitical tensions, it's Turkey and Washington, it's Turkey and Europe. Will it make a difference depending on who's elected on November 3rd in the White House?
I mean, we've made scenarios for all emerging markets. We've just published a report a couple of days ago, and we're looking at 5 different scenarios, and most of them are actually status quo for emerging markets in general, with the exception perhaps democratic clean sweep, which actually eventually could be beneficial for emerging markets, especially the commodity producers when the dust settles, depending on the infrastructure investment plan. I think one scenario which obviously could weigh on risk appetite in emerging markets at large would be a delayed and a contested outcome if it creates some uncertainty.
Murat, good morning. I've been dying to talk to you because you are hugely qualified to touch upon the political morass of the Black Sea and all of these competing forces, as with Francine Lacroix's important interview this morning with a gentleman from Armenia. I don't want you to give us a political treatise here, but I do want you to fold in the political upset, including the Minsk Group, the United States, France, and Russia, as it touches upon Turkish lira. Can HSBC model out an 8, a 9, or even a 10 Turkish lira?
Well, Tom, I mean, as you might appreciate, geopolitics and factoring this in is extremely difficult. I mean, you can talk about risk premium, but as I said, early on, we've already seen, tightening measures from authorities in Turkey that will have an impact with a lag. And, talk about Russia, again, geopolitics is extremely difficult to quantify, but actually, as the macro outlook and balances in Russia are pretty strong. I mean, we compare emerging markets against each other, especially large economies. We actually expect Russian ruble to get lower. We think it's undervalued. We think the macro balance are very strong, very high reserves, good monetary fiscal policy. I mean, geopolitics is extremely difficult to quantify, so we try to look more on the macro balances and compare countries against each other.
Let's go back to your electrical engineering background, and let's think of a Wheatstone bridge. Does Turkey have the circuitry to, at some point, defend Turkish lira?
I'll come back to the same point. I mean, there are a lot of measures have been taken. I think liquidity tightening is important. The economic program, there has been special consumption tax hikes to rein on credit growth. I think this will moderate credit growth over time and probably improve the imbalances going into 2021. These are all macro measures, steps in the right direction, and it will take some lag for them to work out.
Murat, how do you look at renminbi when you look at some of, even the confidence report that HSBC just put out? Where do you see the biggest value?
Yeah, no, renminbi is a currency we're very constructive about. We actually do recommend being long on renminbi against US dollar. We expect it to fall 670 at the end of the year and 660 at the end of next year. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them is, clearly Chinese economy is outperforming. We had the Caixin Services PMI for September this morning showing the 5th consecutive month of improvement. That obviously, speaks for itself. That is a better economic recovery and normalization. But it's also the balance of payments, because this year we expect China to have a very healthy current account surplus, nearly 2% of GDP, a trade surplus. Exports are doing well because China has normalized its supply chains and production function early on. It is selling to the rest of the world, the goods that are needed, like healthcare equipment, consumer electronics, etc. And also the tourism outflows that are usually huge and that cause service deficits will not happen this year, which means you have a trade surplus, you have a services surplus, a healthy current account surplus, but at the same time, substantial fund inflows because of inclusion of Chinese bonds and equities into key global indices. So it's a healthy capital account that is helping the currency, and also the growth outperformance helping the currency. So we're pretty constructive, actually.
Murat, is there, if you assume that there's going to be extra tensions between the U.S., no matter who's in the White House, and China, possibly between Europe and China, are we going to see much more trade between China and other emerging markets in the region, and what does that mean for their currencies?
I mean, for instance, that has been already happening. This is a very long-term trend. I give you some numbers. Emerging market exports to the U.S. 2 decades ago was 27% of the total. Now it's 17%. Europe is broadly the same, with a share of around 22, 23. But exports to China, dialed back, when China ascended to WTO in early 2000, it was only 3-4% of the total. Now it's 16, 17%. To me, the direction is very clear. Obviously it takes time, but the answer to your question is yes.
Murat, I need to make some money here. I guess that the theme today on a Friday is Asia Pacific is doing well. What is the tradable opportunity in a burgeoning Asia Pacific rim?
Yeah, well, good question, Tom. As I mentioned, we're constructive on renminbi. Our colleagues have outright, trade suggestions there, being long on renminbi. Chinese bonds is another avenue where we're quite constructive. Despite a better recovery in China, we think the monetary conditions will be supportive. But at the same time, there is this huge index inclusion-driven inflows into China. Our colleagues are looking for the recent inclusion of Chinese bonds into FTA-CWGBI indices to induce pretty substantial inflows starting from next year, like, $12.5 billion per month, totaling $150 billion over a year. So that still is, clearly stands out. I think in Asia there are opportunities that we still like.
Right.
The most is centered about China. Yeah.
And the shock Philippine peso at 48. That's a different story for another day. Murat Olgun, thank you so much. Particularly those delicate questions on the Black Sea and the affairs of politics. Murat Olgun with HSBC, their global head of EM research. On a Friday, sort of coming in here in the United States to a longer weekend for many. Columbus Day. We'll be here Columbus Day, just so you know that. Futures up 14. I didn't know that. Dow futures up 108. The VIX, very importantly, 26.04. David Weston in this political season, he is on fire. This was going to be a normal interview. It's not. Rick Snyder of Michigan with a present governor who is safe. This is Bloomberg.
The Census Bureau has asked Congress for a 120 extension. I don't know that you even have to ask, and I think 120 days isn't nearly enough.
The Boston Symphony Orchestra presents BSO at Home. While you stay inside, enjoy a curated collection of archived concerts and behind-the-scenes stories from BSO musicians. BSO Homeschool provides lessons for music lovers of all ages. New performances and messages from musicians are added regularly. Enjoy these selections and much more at bso.org/at-home.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
I think the Fed can do more, and I'm sure we will look at all our options, but those aren't substitutes for fiscal policy. I right now would be hesitant to see us doing more in that area because I don't see the benefits. I could see how it would further add fuel to the financial markets. I'm more skeptical how much it would help the real economy.
The gentleman from Dallas with our Kathleen Hayes. I really can't convey enough, folks, the idea of how unusual this conversation is, buried in the news flow of this political season, and indeed some of the business stories that we've seen, IBM yesterday, the Morgan Stanley announcement as well, was a stunning speech by Jerome Powell to the National Association for Business Economics. Kaplan follows up there with comments. Francine, I just really got to say it's absolutely unprecedented, the Federal Reserve discussion of fiscal policy in this nation.
Well, Tom, I would also say that it's pretty unprecedented to have a president reverse track on the stimulus bill within, I don't know if it was 72 hours.
Oh, I think you could say four times.
Yeah, and that's impacting. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
No, I don't mean, I just think the zeitgeist here, folks, as we wake up on a Friday as a president who was nudging back yesterday, Francine, towards a larger stimulus. He was approving Mnuchin to nudge towards where Speaker Pelosi is.
Right, but so many questions, Tom, about why, all of a sudden he tweeted that actually he didn't want a stimulus and that it would have to wait until after the election, maybe then realized this was a bad political calculation. When you look at the markets, which is what we should look at, it certainly fell after that tweet, and then it didn't change that much when he said a bigger stimulus is on the table. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg. Business Flash, Tom, with Ritika Gupta. Hi, Ritika.
Hi, Francine. Tom. L'Oreal plans to close stores as part of a restructuring of its U.S. luxury operations. About 400 jobs will be cut. The French cosmetics plans to shift investment to growth areas such as e-commerce. The pandemic has hurt L'Oreal. People have been spending less on pricey perfumes and makeup. Tesla's new factory in Austin, Texas, won't just be building an electric truck. Filings suggest that Elon Musk's company also wants to build batteries on the site. The Austin plant will be Tesla's second vehicle assembly factory. Its flagship factory is in California. HCA Healthcare will return $6 billion in emergency virus relief aid it got from the federal government. The largest publicly traded U.S. hospital operator is no longer facing the business squeeze caused by the coronavirus pandemic. CEO Sam Hazen says that returning the money is the socially responsible thing to do. That's your latest Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom, Francine.
Ritika, thanks so much. Greatly appreciated. On this day of the Nobel Prize, the World Food Program of the United Nations is the winner. This organization, with a heritage back to the 1960s, is really extraordinary. I did a whole series of interviews with them a number of years ago during one of the global rice panics. David Daw of the FAO, part of that shop, was absolutely brilliant not to panic on rice, that rice would and always will come back. For those of you just joining in the Zeitgeist today, without question, to hear more from a president recovering and, of course, his desire to have rallies this weekend, he has mentioned Florida and Pennsylvania. As well, coming up, we need an update on the state of the American economy. And from Deutsche Bank, it is a cautious statement. Matthew Lazzetti will join us. Futures up 14, Dow futures up 107, the VIX 26.02. We're looking at modest dollar weakness today. From London, from New York, please stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
Women leaders were actually better at controlling the deaths from COVID-19. Do you think out of this pandemic, we'll see more countries be willing to elect female leaders?
When we look at women leaders, we tend to project on them baggage that they shouldn't bear.
Women are given an opportunity when no one else wants to do the job.
Women had a very clear objective. They wanted to save lives.
The women leaders, if you look at their careers, have also built up a level of trust.
In fact, women have to be better at communication in order to be elected as leaders, whereas this doesn't hold true for men.
We need to get those sexist stereotypes out of our head and give women a fair run for leadership.
Trying to change the stereotypes about women is not only the business of women, but men have to be part of it.
Welcome to That's Debatable, an interactive series on today's most pressing issues. The resolution this time, is it time to redistribute the wealth? Two perspectives.
Pointing to billionaires and saying we should take their money away is ineffective political strategy.
We have a choice in this country, either great wealth in the hands of a few or a democracy.
I'm John Donvan. Join us for That's Debatable, presented by Bloomberg and Intelligence Squared, Friday at 7 p.m.
This morning, or rather their Friday evening, suddenly renminbi, it appreciates against the dollar. China notes, quote, economic bullying against Ant and WeChat. The United States has abused the, quote, national security concept. It's election season. We've forgotten about China. There is a bid, a continued bid to stocks. Futures up nicely this morning. And, well, there is no debate. The president wants rallies now. Think tomorrow, Saturday. Think Florida. Think Pennsylvania. Good morning, everyone. This is Bloomberg Surveillance from New York and London as well. Francine Lacroix, the news flow really quite extraordinary this morning, Francine. We've been Brexit-free. We've been pub-free of the discussion in the United Kingdom. Can I go to a pub this weekend in London?
Tom, we're not Brexit free. I've just spared you so far because we don't have that much news that's market moving. But we are, of course, on Brexit watch. Overall, we know that European leaders, Tom, are having, a crisis moment. This can be Germany, it can be France, it can be Italy, it can be the UK, because of the number of COVID cases increasing and actually the numbers of beds in ICUs because people need them more than they did 2 weeks ago. So we're looking at that, and Brexit negotiations are ongoing, Tom, and there's still that deadline, self-imposed, but still a deadline of October 15th.
And the blurry, folks, I really want to make clear, not the deaths, but the cases dynamics in Europe are actually extraordinary. The slopes of some of those curves are really, really distressing. It has been an extraordinary Thursday. Thanks to our team yesterday for just an incredible news flow through all of the morning. Seems like we're going to do the same thing today. We await for Washington to awake and to drive forward the election story. With our first word news in New York City, here's Ritika Gupta.
Morning, Tom. Francine. The Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to the World Food Programme. The United Nations agency was honored for its efforts to combat hunger and food insecurity around the globe, especially in conflict zones. Last year, the World Food Programme helped close to 100 million people in 88 countries. The White House is once again shifting its position on a stimulus package. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin told House Speaker Nancy Pelosi the administration now wants an agreement on a large-scale relief bill. Earlier this week, the president pulled his negotiators from talks on comprehensive legislation. Meanwhile, Federal Reserve officials are keeping up the pressure on Washington to renew fiscal support for the economy. Dallas Fed President Robert Kaplan tells Bloomberg he sees a slower economy without more stimulus. Boston Fed President Eric Rosengren favors increasing the Fed's asset purchases, but says that's not as good as another relief package. And Louisiana is bracing today for Hurricane Delta. The storm has picked up strength and is now a Category 3 with winds up to 120 miles an hour. It's expected to slam into an area of Louisiana still recovering from Hurricane Laura. The hurricane has forced energy companies to shut down almost all the oil production in the Gulf of Mexico and most of the gas output. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Tom, Francine.
Ritika, thanks so much. Greatly appreciate that. Again, futures lift. It's been day after day. Let me give you those levels. Very important right now. 28,422 on the Dow, 3451 SPX, with a VIX in from 29 into 26.01 today. That gets my attention. I mentioned yuan stronger to 4 digits, 6.7058. That is a big deal. We just heard HSBC consider further renminbi strength. And again, oil with a lift through the day, 40.80 on West Texas Intermediate. Francine?
Yeah, Tom, I'm looking at European stocks. So they're actually gaining as a lot of European companies boosting guidance. And of course, the White House signaled an openness to a large scale stimulus. But we're off the day's high because if you look at the stocks Europe 600, it's gaining some 0.3%. And then you're right to look at renminbi. The other thing I'm looking at is actually some of the European bonds. They're rising as virus cases also surge in the UK and Germany. And you can see euro dollar 117.95, Tom.
Very good. We begin our political coverage today, and we've really tried to do this to get different experienced voices. And we are so fortunate, Bloomberg, to have Wendy Benjamin with us. Wendy Benjaminson was with Associated Press in the battle of the first days of the Trump administration, and with her leadership with the AP in Washington at the time, has war wounds from 2016, and we're thrilled she could join us today. Wendy, is this a redux of 2016?
It It very well could be, where no one ever wants to say that President Donald Trump is out. That's the lesson we learned, is that when the polls show his opponents are up, don't count him out. But this time, I think the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, has some advantages that Hillary Clinton did not have. And all the writing on the wall certainly suggests that if the votes were all counted today, Joe Biden might win.
Well, how important is Florida? You know, your work with AP, your work with McClatchy, and now with Bloomberg, you are steeped in the state-by-state politics here. Is Florida overemphasized? Do the other states matter more?
No, Florida is not overemphasized with the Electoral College. I mean, here it is the ultimate battleground state, as we would say. There is no doubt that Biden is going to carry California and New York. Those are two of the huge Electoral College prizes. They have more votes than other states because of their size and population. Right. Donald Trump will probably win Texas. That's the other big Electoral College prize. And then there's Florida, where one day a poll shows Biden up 11 points, and the next day a poll of the same people, it seems, shows Donald Trump up 2 points. So it's impossible to tell what's going to happen in Florida, and that could very well be the crux of the election.
So, Wendy, what will happen? I mean, when you talk about Florida, are we going to see much more campaigning in Florida? And do we have any insight into why it fluctuates so much, and whether there are any, shy Trump voters?
Well, I do think they are going to be campaigning in Florida. Joe Biden was just there earlier this week, and Donald Trump, of course, has his home there at Mar-a-Lago. He seems to be doing more rallies. I think he did have a rally there recently. The shy Trump voter thing, I think, may not be as much of a factor this time because Donald Trump is no longer an unknown that one could take a chance on. And you might be shy to tell voters that. Pretty much if you support Donald Trump, you're out there and you're happy to say you support Donald Trump. I think the problem is that there's a lot of former Trump voters who are no longer supporting him.
Wendy, one final question. David Weston has had numerous conversations with Speaker Pelosi, but maybe she's not the one to watch. Who is Wendy Benjaminson watching today in the grand stimulus discussion? Who's the player that matters?
Well, I think Nancy Pelosi is definitely the one to watch. And unfortunately, the way this administration works, Donald Trump is always the one to watch. He's sort of got his hands on the lever of this, and, he says they're off, they're off. He says they're on. And it's sort of anyone's guess what'll happen.
Well, we don't know what'll happen in the next 2 hours, but certainly the last few, folks, is the idea of maybe stimulus and the president indicating a lift towards a Pelosi price tag. Wendy Benjaminson, providing leadership for Bloomberg and editor of all of our political coverage. And speaking of that balance of power, David On of PGIM, their CEO in the 12 noon hour. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They move the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
what is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
We explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
Bloomberg Surveillance. Good morning, everyone. Tom Keene in New York, Francine Lacroix in London. Again, the news flow is extraordinary. We're waiting for Washington to wake up again. We thank Wendy Benjaminson of Bloomberg for that recent update moments ago, maybe on what we'll hear from the president today. Right now, it is important to speak to Matthew Lazzetti of Deutsche Bank. They have been absolutely brilliant on the presumed slowdown. And buried in their math, the UCLA math of Matt Lazzetti, are two distressing statistics. To round it up, we go down 3.7% for a year, and then we go up 3.7% for a year, which I think Matt Lazzetti means out 2 years, we're dead flat. Is that really what you see?
Good morning, Tom. Exactly. So you're talking about our GDP trajectory, both for this year and next, down 3.7% this year, up 3.7, 3.8% next year, really only getting back to pre-virus levels of activity around the turn of 2021, 2022. I think that there's obviously some vaccine hopes built in there in the back half of next year where we get growth picking up. Also, some modest fiscal stimulus on the back of the election.
Right.
But there's risks around that.
And what's brilliant here, Matt, is the dispersion of effect of 8 quarters of flat, down and then up, flat, is the distribution of effect on the American public is so different. Does that make it ever more urgent to do stimulus because the have-nots aren't going to participate in a flat 8-quarter economy?
Yeah, I think, you have a crisis, the COVID shock that has induced, which has had very targeted impacts on the U.S. economy in particular sectors. Those high contact industries, whether it's restaurants, retail, leisure and hospitality. It is a very concentrated shock, very different from what we saw with the global financial crisis. It does mean, I think it's easier to provide fiscal stimulus to that shock. We can target it more easily. But unfortunately, we have not seen that fiscal stimulus forthcoming at this point with the talks looking like they're breaking down, despite what we're hearing, overnight from the White House.
What is the size of the stimulus that would make a meaningful impact on the U.S. economy, Matthew?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that we still think needs to be done. We think that you need to re-up at least part of the unemployment insurance that is rolling off. So far, I think everybody's been surprised at how resilient consumer spending has been, even as those unemployment insurance benefits have taken a step down. But I'd note that when we had the original $600, 5 out of every 6 unemployed people were still receiving 100% of their income. When it took a step down to $300, at least 50% were still receiving 100% of their income. Going down to 0, which we will see, is a meaningful hit. I think you also need to get targeted support to airlines, PPP loans for small businesses, many of which would need to take an additional loan if we don't see social distancing going away over the next several months. Those add up to significant amounts, particularly if you want to add it in state and local. So the packages that have been talked about between $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion makes sense, but I see no way that you're getting Senate Republicans on board for that.
Okay, so Matthew, where do you worry about the most scarring in the economy?
It's an interesting one because many of the metrics that we would look at from the GFC and elsewhere aren't really showing the types of scarring effects that we had seen. Former Fed Chair Yellen had noted income expectations in the University of Michigan survey, which had plunged and remained very low for several years. They did plunge in response to this shock, but actually rebound pretty quickly. Again, in that survey, if you look at people, what the probability of becoming unemployed is, which can be a scarring effect. It did shoot up, but it's actually rebounded back down pretty quickly. And again, the wealth effect, which was, I think, huge with the global financial crisis, as wealth remained low for a protracted period. We don't have that here, given how quickly risk assets have rebounded.
I want to get out front of Deutsche Bank clients. Peter Hooper hates me for this, but let's go there. Matt Lazzetti, what is the topic you're studying to report on in your Monday note for Deutsche Bank?
I think everybody right now.
Okay, guys, I'm moving down to more profit stop for Japanese yen. Yeah. So I'm moving my stop to 105.914. Yeah, it's nice. Resistance level, yeah, if some people knows what I'm talking about, so we'll see. Okay, that's it.
Negative outcome from the election is the second most likely, which is Biden wins and you get a Republican Senate. So that, I think, is the real risk out there. If that is the outcome of the election, we don't have a big fiscal stimulus in train that all these macro trades are being based on.
Oh, nicely stated, and we'll come back more with Matt Lazzetti here. Lots to talk about. I'm really interested in business confidence after the transactions that we saw announced yesterday. The IBM one didn't get enough play yesterday in the news blur. Absolutely historic to see the breakup of 109-year-old international business machines. In the open, Mohammed El-Arian of the University of Cambridge and Allianz, of course, writing for Bloomberg Opinion. Dr. El-Arian, on these historic times. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
Me gustaría decirle a los empleadores que fueran más humanitarios con sus trabajadores, que les hagan valer sus derechos. Y estábamos viviendo en dos casas, en unas 50 personas y en la otra otras 50. En cada casa había 5 habitaciones. En cada habitación había de 3 a 4 camas abarrotadas. Vivíamos de 6 a 7 personas. Un baño para cada habitación y una cocina para todas. Una vez que nos atendieron en el hospital, al salir nos avisó una compañera que ya nos habían reportado a migración. Gracias a Dios ahorita de salud yo estoy muy bien, pero en lo moral no estoy muy bien, porque a causa de esa enfermedad yo perdí todo, perdí mi trabajo. Yo creo que mi caso resulta un gran problema de cómo las personas migrantes estamos en riesgo de explotación por parte de los empleadores.
their CPG history, their experience, and really how we might be able to combine together to really create this fantastic public company. And so we kind of got into the SPAC thing a little bit before it became such a hot method of going public.
We want to help the airline workers. There is legislation that we had in the CARES Act, which we hope that we could continue for another 6 months or so. That expired the end of September. We can do that separately, but we cannot do it unless there's a big bill. So it could be part of a big bill, or it could be separate from a big bill from a timing standpoint.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi there talking to our David Weston, and this, of course, is as markets are focusing on that possible stimulus package from the U.S. and that's supporting markets worldwide. Tom, in the last couple of minutes, we also have a headline from Spain. The Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, saying that he will declare a state of emergency in Madrid. Now, this is according to the Sexta, which is one of the local TV stations. Tom, this is significant because it's actually possibly one of the only ways that Spain can put extra restrictions in place. Remember yesterday, we broke that headline that a judge had ruled that the travel restrictions in and out of cities might be necessary to fight the spread of coronavirus, but that under the current legal framework, they were considered violating residents' fundamental rights. And so the only way to get around this is for the Spanish Prime Minister to invoke basically a state of emergency, and then he can do what he wants in terms of lockdown and restrictions.
Yeah, it's an American hour here, folks, but this is a really, really important story. And Francine, I want to stop the program right now to just go a little bit into this. This is hugely political and really shows a polarity, Francine, of the socialist leadership versus the conservative leadership of Madrid. Do I have that right?
Yes, and this goes, Tom, to, what we thought was a pretty surprising court case yesterday with that judge going against the government in saying that, they can't really impose a partial lockdown in the Spanish capital and its suburbs. So, regional officials had appealed the application of these stricter measures, and the court said, well, actually, you're right. They can't go, into tougher measures unless it's a emergency declaration.
Well, it will be most interesting. I mean, we'll follow this story through a Friday afternoon, but it is really across all of Europe with France and Spain leading the way, difficult pandemic stories. Francine?
Yeah, Tom, we were talking to Matthew Lazzetti, Deutsche Bank chief U.S. economist, and we were talking to Matthew, of course, about the fiscal stimulus in the U.S. We, I think, mentioned also the Fed. But Matthew, overall, how difficult is it for, a chief economist, you're the U.S. chief economist, but it could be a world chief economist, to look at what kind of economy we'll have in 6 months, given these extra restrictions that frankly pop up also in countries where they had a good handle. So it could happen in Germany, like we're seeing at the moment, but it could happen really in a number of U.S. states as well.
You're absolutely right. I think if you look back a few months ago, there was, a theme that was emerging, which was European outperformance economically in the second half of the year, and that was based on the fact that there was a view that Europe had just handled the virus so much better, and it was just continuing to rage in the U.S. We're seeing, obviously, that there's difficulties containing the virus, in many places across different approaches. Certainly even in the U.S. with, New York and New Jersey recently seeing the highest growth rates since May. And if you look at, a lot of the Midwest seeing record growth rates. So it is, still with us. It is still hampering economic activity, particularly for, the services sector. But I think, on the flip side, we continue to get, in general, better news on the vaccine, hope and belief in the vaccine, at least by being broadly distributed by mid or the end of next year, which should help for normalization at that point. But until then, I think it is going to be with us, and it's going to be continuing to hamper the economies.
Matt Lazzetti, we saw yesterday huge transactions in history made in corporate officers working strategically. What is the underlying confidence of the business community, not the beleaguered small business community, but the more prosperous, continuing forward business community right now? If we get a Deutsche Bank flatness for 8 quarters, do they maintain a business confidence to do transactions?
Yeah, I think you've had, it's been a very unique recession and recovery in the sense that CapEx equipment spending is actually fully normalized. What has really remained depressed is consumer spending, and particularly consumer spending on the services sector, which is your typical thing that is very resilient to shocks. I think there's a divergence between the small businesses and medium and larger businesses, just purely driven by that. And bit larger businesses are, looking at Asia and China and other economies that are rebounding better, global trade, which is rebounding better. And that gives a greater sense, I think, of optimism. Larger businesses also have more resilient plans to I think, respond to shocks and to plan for the future. So there's a dichotomy here where I think you do have small businesses, particularly those focused on services, underperforming significantly.
Yeah, we'll be watching that carefully, particularly inflation and disinflation dynamics of services and goods. Matthew Lazzetti, thank you so much with Deutsche Bank. I really can't emphasize enough, folks, the shock of their paragraph of roughly negative 3.5%, then positive 3.5%, stretching out over a full 2 years. That's a really important statistic. Futures up 15, Dow futures up 126. In the 3 o'clock hour, Scott Minerd will join. This is Bloomberg.
Ada 3 kelompok pengungsi tersebut yang sudah berpencar arah. Kemudian kami dari Polsek Banda Sakti berkoordinasi dengan perangkat desa Kampung Jomblang melakukan upaya pengumpulan secara persuasif serta minta tolong kepada warga. Alhamdulillah warga yang terpecah semuanya berkumpul.
Some things you see coming, some things you don't. The trick is to be ready for anything. John from Infrastructure Support is working every day to keep essential market data flowing seamlessly. We keep on, so you can keep on.
Market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Rishka Gupta with the Bloomberg First Word News. The Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to the World Food Programme. The United Nations agency was honoured for its efforts to combat hunger and food insecurity around the globe. Looks like the on-again, off-again talks for a large-scale stimulus bill are back on again. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin told House Speaker Nancy Pelosi that President Trump now wants a comprehensive relief package. Earlier this week, the president ended talks and said they wouldn't resume until after the election. And President Trump says he feels really good and hopes to hold a campaign rally in Florida on Saturday. The White House doctor has given him the go-ahead for public engagements starting this weekend. It was a week ago today that the president was hospitalized with the coronavirus. And the Justice Department has sued Yale University, claiming it illegally discriminates against white and Asian American applicants. The lawsuit claims the school favors Black and Hispanic students in undergraduate admissions. The Trump administration had previously threatened Yale to stop considering an applicant's race or national origin. Yale responded that it would not abandon its race-conscious process. Global News 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Tom Francine.
Ritika Gupta, thank you so much. What a busy day yesterday. I mean, any number of transactions. This is a smaller one, $7 billion, no big deal. And yet is the heritage of Boston Mutual Fund investing going back to around 1925. Eaton Vance, a roll-up of many different mutual fund companies, including recently Scudder, into Eaton Vance, and they finally jettisoned yesterday to James Gorman of Morgan Stanley. Let us listen to the acquisitive Gorman.
This has been a 10-year strategy to take what is an extraordinary investment bank and trading business, clean that up in terms of the risk management of that business, take away the prop trading, use our capital more effectively, and it's doing unbelievably well. And then we had to pivot to build up the wealth management business, which we did first through Smith Barney, and then Solium, and then E-Trade, which gave us the digital platform. And now we're doing it on the asset management side, which we did with Mesa West a couple of years ago, very small boutique on the west coast of the U.S., and now, excitingly, with Eaton Vance. So we think for 2030 specifically, you'll find a very stable, faster growing, very fee-based institution, well-capitalized, strong liquidity.
Now, James, explain to me the strategy here. Now, are you making Morgan Stanley for the masses? Are you trying to be all things to everybody now that you've added this large brokerage and this massive asset manager?
Well, no, not at all. I mean, we've done many deals since I've been CEO. We sold oil storage and oil transportation businesses, Hadamar and Transmontane. We sold mortgage servicing businesses, Saxon. We sold European private banks. We sold a business called Quilter in the UK, Azores in Spain, and so on and so on. So we've been reshaping the portfolio. This is about originating, distributing, and managing capital for individuals, institutions, and governments around the world. That's what we do. So being in the asset management space, in the wealth management space, in the trading space, the underwriting space is all consistent. It's all part of that process of originating, managing, distributing capital. So frankly, I think we're a more focused company, certainly than most of the peer set that we deal with.
Now, James, this has been an expensive deal also, but at the end of the day, it's what this deal will deliver to shareholders in the future. It all comes down to profit, about margin. How do you explain the economics to them in the longer term?
Well, I've met a lot of people who want to buy great companies cheaply, and they end up not buying anything. And hopefully you don't buy underperforming companies with a lot of money. If you're going to buy a great asset, listen, Eaton Vance has been around for over 90 years. World-class, huge talent, perfectly complementary businesses. There'll be very little dislocation, high growth, some great businesses with Parametrics in particular has been growing very fast. Their traditional asset management space, the Calvert funds in sustainability. So this was a no-brainer. We paid $4 for it. I make no bones about that. But that's what you have to do if you want to buy high-quality businesses. And they came to us. They wanted to be part of the Morgan Stanley business, and our cultures align. Listen, it's mildly accretive day one. It used up about 100 basis points of CET1, which is our core regulatory capital ratio. But we've accreted about 100 basis points this year. So we're sort of back to neutral. So it's going to be a terrific deal over the long run. I'm not worried about the financials at all.
So it makes the asset manager pretty big here. It makes it above 1.2 trillion at this point. It's still a fraction of where BlackRock and Vanguard and even where JP Morgan is. How do you compete with those rivals at this point?
Well, they're completely different businesses. I mean, Vanguard and BlackRock are largely index or exchange rated businesses. You know, we're not trying to be the biggest. We're just trying to do, Shanali, I've often said you don't do strategy through envy. That's how you make mistakes. You do strategy based upon what works and what's important to your institution. To have a $1.2 trillion asset management company from where we were 10 years ago is unbelievable. I don't care that there are others who are bigger. That's not the point. The point is, are we generating the returns we need for our shareholders? And are we providing the clients with the opportunity that they need for the best product out there? And through this deal between our asset management business and Eaton Vance, it is absolutely happening.
And as Mr. Gorman mentions there, in the time of a rage of ESG, he acquires Calvert. I should point out, pushing 40 years ago, Calvert and John Rogers of Chicago single-handedly invented responsible investing. It was absolutely original at the time. Always original. Shanali Basak joins us right now. Shanali, I've got two key questions. One is, clearly he overpaid. Was this a defensive transaction? And who was he worried that would take Eaton Vance if he didn't act?
I wouldn't call it defensive, only because out of the large banks, you're seeing Morgan Stanley come out and make the biggest deals on Wall Street. And, you know, he did overpay, but at the same time, that asset management business has been limping along in terms of assets under management for a very long time. It's been hovering below $600 billion, making it the baby of the group. And so this will catapult him above $1 trillion, finally bringing him at scale and giving him that third leg of the business that he's wanted for a long time now, Tom.
Shanali, Mr. Gorman is a beast of McKinsey, and at McKinsey he was acclaimed for working with Merrill Lynch, developing online, developing a new modern retail presence for Merrill Lynch. Fold that experience into where Morgan Stanley's heading.
Right. You have the wealth management expert. You have this consultant that's looking at the strategic vision. You heard it from him himself. Morgan Stanley spent so much of their time in the last decade shrinking, right-sizing. Out of the top 5 banks, they were the smallest. But now you have them finally making James Gorman's probably his last significant marks on the business. He did say...
Oh, come on. Come on, why? What are you doing? You want to announce on air he's retiring or whatever? Why would this? Why would this? Oh, stop! Why would this be his last effort? To review this, folks, he's taken E-Trade in. He's taken in Eaton Vance, venerable firm. How do you meld those two? And what's the next Gorman step? Don't tell me it's retirement.
Well, he did say he'd be stepping down in the next few years.
Yeah,
so
I'll give you a few. Mr. Diamond's been stepping down for a decade, okay? What's Mr. Gorman's next step here?
Mr. Gorman's next step here, and that's why I asked him, do you want to be everything to everybody? He said he was not trying to be the biggest of everything, but he wants the highest returns. So let's see if he can get JP Morgan-like returns at a smaller scale. That's his objective here. Now, the fee pressure in the asset management business is something that most people are worried about. You mentioned Calvert, ESG. Fixed income is a huge business here. You also have Parametric, which is the custom indexing business, where a lot of people on Wall Street are more excited about the prospects, maybe higher fees associated with that business. E-Trade, you have another strategy. You do have a different client base that is the everyday person. When he bought E-Trade, he said he saw a future when it came to digital banking. So you have Morgan Stanley taking what they already do, expanding their wings a little bit further, but they're not expanding it insofar as that they would take on Credit Suisse on a global scale in wealth management, which you would think would be maybe their next natural move. He's staying in the U.S., he's getting a broader base of people, and he's trying to get as much profitability from that specific base as he can.
Shanali, how does he go after millennials? Is E-Trade enough to make sure that he's strong amongst that group?
Well, there's E-Trade, but there's also Solium that he had bought, I guess, last year now, about a year ago. And so that was a stock plan administrator. It's gotten him to work with a lot of high-flying startups and the employee base across those startups. And so he's starting to get to employees of companies that are a little bit younger, an employee base that can grow into wealth. And that's the plan. But as you know, Francine, there's a lot of competition in that market right now, including some upstarts like Robinhood, which is only really 7 years old. And E-Trade is a much older business, but we are seeing those newer companies gain a lot of share very quickly.
Janelle, is this going to spur other, big Wall Street banks to look for acquisitions?
The other Wall Street banks, I believe they have wanted to for some time. This is an interesting time to see acquisitions because the Federal Reserve is keeping such a tight eye on capital distributions from these banks. On the other hand, James Gorman can make the point that this business de-risks Morgan Stanley. It makes it safer, less reliant on those high-octane trading businesses. But the other banks, if they're looking for acquisition, if Goldman wants to go out and buy a regional, for example, will it be able to under the current constraints of this environment?
Shonali Basak, thank you for the reporting. Wonderful interview there with Mr. Gorban, the inquisitive one, on Eaton Vance. There are headlines out, and this is the continuation, the two-day derby by the Trump administration, pretty much through Fox. This is the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross. Of course, he, over the years, has been doing roll-ups in the steel industry. Speaking of aluminum dumping, and it is a tariff-based statement, as we heard a tariff-based statement from President Trump yesterday. He talked about tariffs into second term with China. This is on the aluminum industry and aluminum dumping. Mr. Ross and the Trump administration will clamp down. Coming up, a pandemic update as we see these headlines on the political uproar in Madrid over the pandemic. Andrew Peckhouse of the Johns Hopkins University. This is Bloomberg Futures Up 15.
Everything around us, including the way we work and live, has been interrupted. Uninterrupted service is peace of mind. Kimmy from customer support is responding to a 500% increase in daily call volume, no matter what. We keep on, so you can keep on.
Good morning, everyone. Bloomberg Surveillance, Tom Keene and Francine Lacroix. We digress. Andrew Peckhouse with us with the Johns Hopkins University, and of course, one of the nation's great virologists in this horrific pandemic. On this day, where we consider the food program of the United Nations. The World Food Program is an extraordinary vehicle with the FAO at the UN that has been profoundly important over 50 years in just simply stopping starvation. Andrew, I've never asked this question in the pandemic, and I guess it speaks to India and poorer countries. Fold nutrition into recovery of a virus-infected patient. Tell me, I mean, we're all fat and happy in America as a general statement. Fold in the importance of nutrition within a pandemic.
Well, good health is one of the factors that really drives the differences that we see in terms of disease severity and disease prevalences across different areas. A lot more factors play into it, but if we're going to focus on nutrition, being fat in America is probably not a good thing.